Good evening, and welcome back to Background Historian. Tonight we will take a dive down a dark yet illuminating path of history, the medieval ages. From knights, feudal lords, and peasants, these years represented brutality, hierarchy, and religious exploration. Before we begin, if you have any themes or topics you'd like to see on a future episode of Background Historian, leave a comment and I'll be sure to cover them. Let's begin the journey. Part 1, Introduction and Early Medieval Foundations. The medieval world did not begin in a single year, nor did it suddenly emerge fully formed. Rather, it grew slowly, like the weaving of an immense tapestry whose threads came from many lands, peoples, and traditions. It began in the shadow of a fallen empire, Rome, whose roads still cut across the land, whose aqueducts still whispered of ancient engineering, and whose language, laws, and faith still lingered like fading echoes. It is here, in the early medieval centuries, roughly from the 5th to the 10th century, that we step into a world that is both familiar and strange. Familiar in that it holds the seeds of the Europe we recognize today, the languages, the nations, the faiths. Strange in that it was a time when life was far more fragile, seasons ruled existence, and power rested not in sprawling bureaucracies, but in the personal bonds between lords and their vassals. Tonight, as you drift into rest, imagine that you are standing on a small hill in this early medieval landscape. The sun is low, casting a golden glow across fields of barley. In the distance, a cluster of thatched roofs rises from the green, a village, smoke curling from chimneys. Beyond that, the faint outline of a fortified manor stands against the horizon. This is a land in transition, where ancient ruins mingle with new wooden halls, and where the old gods have not yet fully vanished from the minds of the people. The world after Rome. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the late 5th century, it left behind not only its monumental architecture and Latin tongue, but also a vacuum of political and military power. Across Europe, Germanic tribes, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Franks, Lombards, Saxons, and others, established their own kingdoms. These were not empires in the Roman sense. They were smaller, more localized realms, built on kinship, loyalty, and the authority of powerful warlords. In some places, Roman influence remained strong. The roads still carried merchants and messengers. Roman law still shaped rulings. In others, especially in the more remote northern lands, Rome's memory faded quickly, and local traditions flourished. It was an age of blending, Roman and barbarian, Christian and pagan, urban and rural. The countryside became the heartbeat of Europe. Cities shrank. Many who once lived in bustling Roman towns moved outward into small farming communities. Here, life followed the rhythm of the seasons, sowing in the spring, tending in the summer, harvesting in the autumn, and enduring the long, quiet winters. Faith in transition. Religion during this time was a patchwork quilt. Christianity, once persecuted, had become the dominant faith of Rome and was spreading steadily through Europe. But the old pagan traditions, worship of the sun, the moon, the sacred grove, the river spirit, persisted. In the early medieval villages, one might find a Christian cross beside a well that had been dedicated to a water goddess for generations. Missionaries traveled long distances to bring the Christian faith to new peoples. They built small wooden churches and taught in the open air. Monks carried sacred texts across mountains, copying them by hand in scriptoria. Yet even as Christianity spread, it often absorbed elements of older traditions. A sacred oak might be renamed for a saint, a festival once marking the solstice might be recast as a holy day. This blending of beliefs shaped the medieval mind. Faith was not just a Sunday matter, it infused every aspect of life. From birth to death, blessings, prayers, and rituals accompanied each step. The shape of society. Early medieval society was structured around loyalty and obligation. Without the centralized power of Rome, protection and stability came from personal bonds. A powerful leader, a king, duke, or count, offered his warriors land or wealth in exchange for service. Those warriors, in turn, had their own followers. At the base of this pyramid were the farmers, or peasants, who worked the land in return for protection. The land itself was the true wealth of the age. It fed the people, supported armies, and provided resources for trade. But unlike in Rome's great estates, early medieval holdings were more scattered and personal. A noble's power depended on how many loyal followers he could support, not simply on the size of his territory. The villages and countryside. In the early medieval countryside, most people lived in small villages of perhaps a dozen to 30 families. Homes were built of wood, with thatched roofs and dirt floors. Inside, a single smoky room might house an entire family, along with a few animals during the winter months. Work began at dawn and ended with the setting sun. Men tilled the fields, repaired fences, and tended livestock. Women brewed ale, baked bread, spun wool, and cared for children. Everyone, even the youngest, contributed in some way. Life was tied to the natural world in a way that is difficult to imagine today. The planting and harvesting depended on weather patterns. A bad frost could mean hunger for the year. Illness could sweep through a village without warning. And yet, in these challenges, there was also community. Neighbors helping each other repair a roof, or sharing food during lean months. The lords and their halls. Overseeing the surrounding villages were the local lords. These men and their families lived in fortified halls, often on raised ground or behind wooden palisades. Their homes were larger, with multiple rooms and more substantial furnishings, but they too were drafty and dimly lit by modern standards. The lord's role was both protector and ruler. He maintained a small armed force, settled disputes, and collected dues from those who worked his lands. In return, he was expected to defend his people from raiders and uphold justice according to the customs of the land. Feasts in the Lord's Hall marked special occasions, weddings, victories, religious festivals. These gatherings were lively, with music, storytelling, and the sharing of prized dishes like roasted meats and honeyed cakes. Trade and travel. Although the early medieval world was less urban than the Roman era, trade did not vanish. Merchants traveled by river and sea, carrying salt, furs, wine, and cloth between distant lands. Coastal and riverine settlements became important points of exchange, and some grew into small market towns. Travel was slow and often dangerous. Roads, once carefully maintained by Roman engineers, had fallen into disrepair. Bandits and wild animals posed threats. Many people never ventured more than a few miles from their birthplace. Yet for those who did, the early medieval world offered a network of paths, ferries, and hospitable monasteries where travelers could rest. The cultural memory. One of the remarkable features of the early medieval age was its memory of the past. Even as political structures shifted, the stories of Rome, of ancient heroes, and of the saints were told and retold. Bards and minstrels sang of legendary kings and warriors. In the halls of lords and in the cloisters of monasteries, history was preserved through both oral tradition and painstakingly copied manuscripts. These stories served as more than entertainment. They offered moral lessons, reinforced ideals of bravery and loyalty, and provided a sense of connection to a larger human story. The landscape of power. Power in the early medieval world was fluid. Alliances shifted, and boundaries changed with each generation. Some kings ruled vast territories, others held only a cluster of valleys. Marriage alliances could be as important as battles in determining the fate of a kingdom. In some regions, particularly in the Frankish lands, rulers began to consolidate power, laying the groundwork for what would become larger medieval states. In others, such as Britain, kingdoms remained small and fragmented, constantly at war or in uneasy truces. The quiet strength of the early Middle Ages. To modern eyes, the early medieval period can seem like a time of darkness, a step backward from the grandeur of Rome. Yet for those who lived in it, it was a world alive with meaning, community, and faith. It was a world in which the land was both a livelihood and a heritage, where the bonds between people could mean survival, and where each sunrise brought the promise, and the challenge, of another day. As you imagine lying beneath a woolen blanket in a simple wooden home, the sounds of the village fading into night, you can picture the glow of the hearth, the murmur of quiet conversation, and the knowledge that beyond the fields, the world is vast, full of kingdoms rising and falling, and stories yet to be told. This is where our journey through the Middle Ages begins, in the fields and halls, the chapels and markets, of an age finding its footing in the shadow of a fallen empire. From here, the centuries will unfold into the vibrant, complex, and deeply human world we now call medieval. Part 2: Feudalism and Social Hierarchies. If the early medieval centuries were the soil in which Europe's new culture took root, then feudalism was the great oak that grew from it, its trunk rising from deep roots of land, loyalty, and obligation, its branches stretching across the countryside. The system of feudalism was not a written constitution nor a single law laid down by kings. Rather, it was a living arrangement, a social order that evolved naturally over time, shaped by the need for security, stability, and the ability to govern a scattered and largely rural population. To understand medieval life, one must understand feudalism, for it was the invisible framework that bound together kings, lords, knights, and peasants, weaving them into a network of duties, rights, and privileges. It was at once a political structure, an economic system, and a way of thinking about the world. The roots of feudalism. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, centralized government crumbled along with it. The Roman legions that had patrolled the roads were gone, and the administrative machinery that once collected taxes and enforced laws vanished. Local leaders, often powerful warriors, stepped into the void, offering protection in return for service. By the time we reach the height of the medieval period, this arrangement had become formalized into a hierarchy. At its core was land, the most valuable resource of the age. Land provided food, shelter, and wealth, and it could be granted as a reward for loyalty or withdrawn as punishment for betrayal. In feudal society, every piece of land had an owner, and every owner had obligations. Even the king, in theory the supreme ruler, held his crown by the grace of God and the support of his most powerful nobles. The pyramid of power. The structure of feudal society is often compared to a pyramid, wide at the base, narrow at the top, each layer supporting the one above. At the top stood the king. He was the ultimate authority in the realm, but his actual power varied greatly. In strong kingdoms, such as under Charlemagne's reign, the king's word carried across vast territories. In weaker ones, his authority might be little more than ceremonial, with true control resting in the hands of powerful dukes or counts. Beneath the king were the great lords, dukes, counts, earls, margraves, who controlled large swaths of land known as fiefs. These men were often related to the king by blood or marriage, and their loyalty was essential for the stability of the realm. In return for their lands, they owed the king military service, counsel, and sometimes a share of their income. Below the great lords came the lesser nobles, barons, viscounts, and knights, who held smaller estates. Many of these nobles were vassals to more than one lord, a situation that could create both opportunity and conflict. A knight might owe military service to one baron but also be bound by oath to a duke, and if those two lords came into conflict, his loyalties would be tested. At the bottom of the pyramid stood the peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population. Some were free, able to own or rent land, but many were serfs, bound to the land they worked, unable to leave without their lord's permission. The lord and vassal relationship. At the heart of feudalism was the bond between lord and vassal. This was a deeply personal relationship, formalized through a ceremony known as homage. In this ritual, the vassal would kneel before the lord, place his hands between the lord's, and swear an oath of loyalty. The lord, in turn, would promise to protect the vassal and grant him land or some form of income. The land granted to a vassal was called a fief, and it could vary widely in size, from a single village to an entire county. The vassal did not own the land outright, he held it in trust, on the condition that he fulfilled his duties to his lord. Those duties often included military service. The vassal was expected to fight for his lord, typically for a set number of days each year. Financial aid. The vassal might be required to contribute money for the lord's ransom if he was captured, for the knighting of the lord's eldest son, or for the marriage of his eldest daughter. Counsel. The vassal was expected to attend the lord's court, offering advice and supporting him in legal disputes. This arrangement created a web of interlocking obligations that bound the realm together. A king depended on his dukes and counts for soldiers and resources. Those dukes and counts depended on their barons and knights, and all depended on the peasants who worked the land. The manor system. While feudalism describes the political relationships between different ranks of society, the manorial system describes the economic reality that sustained them. The manor was the basic unit of agricultural production, and it was both a farm and a community. A typical manor might include the lord's domain, land reserved for the lord's own use, worked by the peasants as part of their obligations. Peasant holdings, strips of land allotted to individual families, which they farmed to feed themselves. Common areas such as pasture, meadow, and woodland, used collectively for grazing animals or gathering wood. A village where the peasants lived, along with the lord's manor house or castle, a church, and perhaps a mill. The manor was largely self-sufficient. Everything needed for daily life, food, clothing, tools, was produced within its boundaries. Trade was limited, though surplus goods might be sold at nearby markets. The lord of the manor acted as both ruler and protector. He presided over the manor court, resolving disputes and enforcing local customs. In return for the peasants' labor and dues, he was expected to maintain order, provide defense, and uphold justice. Peasants and serfs. The majority of medieval people were peasants, and a large proportion of these were serfs. Serfs were not slaves, they could not be bought or sold individually. But they were bound to the land, and if the land changed hands, they went with it. They could not leave without permission, and their children inherited their status. Serfs owed their lord a variety of obligations. Labor services, working the lord's domain several days a week. Rents in kind, a portion of their grain, livestock, or other produce. Fees, payments for using the lord's mill or oven, or for marrying outside the manor. In return, they received protection and the right to work a piece of land for their own subsistence. Free peasants, by contrast, could move and sell their land, though they still owed taxes or services to the local lord. Knights and chivalry. The military backbone of feudal society was the knight. Knights were mounted warriors, trained from boyhood in the arts of war. They were expensive to equip, armor, weapons, and horses were costly, and so knighthood was usually reserved for the sons of nobles. Knights swore to uphold the code of chivalry, which emphasized loyalty, honor, and the protection of the weak. In reality, knights could be as ruthless as any other warriors, but the ideal of the noble knight became a powerful part of medieval culture, celebrated in songs and stories. A knight might serve directly under his lord or be granted his own fief in return for military service. Some knights became household knights, living permanently in their lord's hall, while others were landed knights who managed their own estates. Women in the feudal system. Women's roles in feudal society were shaped by their social class. Noble women could wield significant influence, especially when their husbands were away at war. They managed estates, oversaw servants, and sometimes acted as regents for young heirs. Peasant women worked alongside men in the fields, in addition to raising children, tending animals, and maintaining the home. Marriage alliances were a key tool of diplomacy among the nobility. A noblewoman's marriage could seal an alliance between powerful families, bringing land, wealth, or military support. The church and feudalism. The medieval church was deeply intertwined with the feudal system. Bishops and abbots often controlled large estates and acted as feudal lords. Monasteries could be wealthy landowners, with peasants working their lands just as on any secular manor. The church also sanctified the feudal hierarchy. It taught that the social order was part of God's plan, with each class having its role. Those who prayed, the clergy; those who fought, the nobility; and those who worked, the peasants. This idea of a divinely ordained hierarchy helped maintain stability, even in times of hardship. Strengths and weaknesses of feudalism. Feudalism provided stability in a time when central authority was weak. It created local networks of defense and governance, ensuring that even the smallest village had a protector and a set of rules. But it also fostered fragmentation, as loyalty was often more to one's immediate lord than to the distant king. Conflicts between lords could erupt into private wars, and the overlapping obligations of vassals sometimes led to tangled disputes. Over time, as kings grew stronger and economies expanded, feudalism began to change, but for centuries, it was the framework on which medieval life rested. An evening in a feudal village. Imagine, for a moment, standing in the village square of a small manor at dusk. The day's work is done, the fields are quiet, and smoke drifts from the chimneys. The manor house stands on a small rise, its timbered walls catching the last light. Inside, the lord and his family dine on roasted fowl, while down in the village, peasants share pottage and bread. It is a world bound together by land and loyalty, by the spoken oath and the silent understanding that each man and woman knows their place. From the humblest serf to the mightiest king, all are part of the same great web, the fabric of feudalism that holds the medieval world together. Part 3: Daily Life of Peasants. If feudalism was the skeleton of medieval society, peasants were its beating heart. They were the ones who tilled the soil, sowed the seeds, tended the animals, and harvested the crops that fed every mouth from the lowliest beggar to the most powerful king. Without their labor, the grand castles, the bustling markets, the processions of knights, and the feasts of nobles would all wither away. And yet, for most peasants, life was not lived in the shadow of the castle keep but in the rhythm of the fields, the seasons, and the tight-knit bonds of their village. To truly understand the Middle Ages, we must walk for a while in the worn leather shoes of the peasant, feel the weight of a hoe in our hands, and hear the creak of the cart wheels as they roll down a muddy track. The village as home. Most peasants lived in small rural villages, usually consisting of a cluster of wooden or wattle-land daub cottages, a central open space or green, and a few essential communal structures. These villages were often located near a water source, a stream, river, or well, and surrounded by fields divided into long, narrow strips. Beyond the fields lay meadows for hay, woodlands for gathering fuel, and sometimes a mill for grinding grain. Villages varied in size, but many housed between 20 and 50 families. Everyone knew everyone else, privacy was rare, and news, whether joyful or grim, traveled quickly. The peasant's house was simple. It might have 1 or 2 rooms, with walls made from woven wooden strips plastered with mud, and a roof of thatch. The floor was packed earth. In the center, a hearth provided heat and light, though smoke often escaped only through a hole in the roof, leaving the air thick and acrid. Furniture was sparse. A wooden table, benches, perhaps a chest for storing valuables, and straw-stuffed mattresses for sleeping. Animals, chickens, goats, sometimes a pig, might share the space, particularly in the winter, both for warmth and protection from theft. The rhythm of the seasons. Peasant life was governed by the changing seasons. Spring was a time of planting, when every able body was needed in the fields. Men and women alike turned the soil with heavy plows, sowed seeds, and repaired fences and ditches. Summer was a season of tending, weeding crops, caring for animals, and preparing for the hay harvest. Autumn was the most critical season of all, the grain harvest. Entire villages turned out to reap the fields, working from dawn to dusk. The harvested grain was threshed to separate the kernels from the chaff, then stored in barns or granaries. Winter was the slow season, a time for mending tools, spinning wool, and telling stories by the fire. But also a time when hunger could creep in if the harvest had been poor. Every task was tied to the land's natural cycles. Failure to plant in time, a week of unexpected frost, or a summer drought could spell disaster for an entire community. Work and labor obligations. Most peasants did not own the land they worked. Instead, they farmed strips of land on the manor, owing the lord a variety of dues. For serfs, this meant several days each week spent laboring on the lord's domain, his personal fields, in addition to tending their own. These duties might include plowing, sowing, reaping, hauling timber, or repairing the lord's buildings. Peasants also owed rents in kind, a portion of their grain, vegetables, eggs, or livestock. They might have to pay to use the lord's mill, oven, or winepress. There were also special fees for events such as marriage, inheritance, or moving away. The work was hard, the hours long, and the tools simple. Plows were heavy wooden frames tipped with iron, drawn by oxen. Sickles and scythes harvested grain, while wooden flails threshed it. Yet peasants developed deep knowledge of their land, which fields drained best, which slopes caught the morning sun, and how to rotate crops to preserve fertility. Diet and food. The peasant diet was plain but sustaining. Bread was the staple, made from rye, barley, or oats in poorer regions, and from wheat where it could be grown. Bread was accompanied by pottage, a thick stew of vegetables such as cabbage, leeks, onions, and beans, flavored with herbs. Meat was rare, often reserved for special occasions, though peasants might keep a pig or hunt small game. Fish, especially in areas near rivers or coasts, provided important protein. Dairy products, milk, butter, and cheese, were common, particularly from goats and sheep. Ale, brewed from barley, was the everyday drink. It was safer than water from uncertain sources and provided calories as well. During religious fasts, which could occur for many days each year, meat and sometimes dairy were forbidden, replaced with fish, grains, and vegetables. Clothing. Peasant clothing was practical and made from readily available materials. Men wore tunics of wool or linen, belted at the waist, with hose or simple trousers. Women wore long dresses with aprons, and in colder months, everyone layered on cloaks and woolen caps or hoods. Footwear, when worn, consisted of leather shoes or boots. Clothing was often dyed with natural materials, plants, roots, bark, and lichens provided shades of brown, green, and dull red. Bright colors were rare among peasants, as richer dyes were expensive and reserved for the nobility. Most garments were made at home. Women spun wool or flax into thread, wove cloth, and sewed clothing for their families. Family and community life. Peasant families were typically large, with many children needed to help in the fields and around the home. Marriage was often practical rather than romantic, arranged to secure labor or strengthen ties between families. Children began contributing to the household from a young age, tending animals, gathering firewood, or watching younger siblings. The community was close-knit. Neighbors worked together at harvest time, shared tools, and helped repair homes or barns after storms. Disputes were handled in the manor court or through local custom. Festivals and holy days provided welcome breaks from labor. These might include religious celebrations like Christmas, Easter, and saints' feast days, as well as seasonal events marking planting or harvest. Such occasions were often accompanied by music, dancing, games, and shared meals. Faith and superstition. Religion was woven into every aspect of peasant life. The village church stood at the center, both physically and socially. The parish priest baptized children, married couples, and buried the dead. He led Sunday Mass and explained the teachings of the church, often using images and stories for those who could not read. Alongside Christian belief, many peasants held to older superstitions. Charms, amulets, and rituals were used to ward off illness or misfortune. A certain herb might be carried for protection, or a whispered phrase spoken before crossing a stream. These practices were not necessarily seen as contradicting Christian faith but as part of the same spiritual landscape. Dangers and hardships. Life for peasants was precarious. Famine was a constant threat, brought on by poor harvests or bad weather. Disease could strike without warning. Even before the Black Death of the 14th century, illnesses such as dysentery, influenza, and smallpox claimed many lives. Violence was another danger. Raids by rival lords, bands of outlaws, or foreign invaders could devastate a village. In times of war, peasants might be pressed into service as foot soldiers or forced to abandon their homes. Yet despite these hardships, peasants endured. They built lives of meaning and community, finding joy in family, faith, and the turning of the seasons. An imagined day. Picture an autumn morning in a medieval village. The air is crisp, and a mist clings to the fields. In a small cottage, the fire has been rekindled from last night's embers. A woman stirs a pot of pottage, while her husband checks the harness on their oxen. Children dart in and out, carrying baskets for the day's harvest. The village stirs to life. Neighbors call greetings as they head to the fields. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoes from his small forge. Farther off, the church bell rings, marking the hour. By midday, the work pauses for a simple meal of bread, cheese, and ale. In the afternoon, the harvest continues until the light begins to fade. Tools are gathered, animals fed, and fires lit once more. In the evening, families gather around the hearth, sharing stories and songs before sleep claims them. This was the life of the peasant, humble, demanding, and bound to the earth, yet essential to the survival of the entire medieval world. Part 4: Daily Life of Nobility. If the peasants formed the sturdy roots of medieval society, the nobility were its branching canopy, visible, prominent, and shaped by the winds of politics and war. While the daily toil of the peasant was focused on survival, the lives of the noble class were bound to the obligations of leadership, the display of status, and the maintenance of a way of life that set them apart from the common folk. To understand the nobility is to see the other side of the medieval coin, a world of fortified walls, hunting parties, lavish feasts, intricate diplomacy, and the constant undercurrent of preparation for war. It was a life with privileges unimaginable to most peasants, yet also one of great responsibility, expectation, and danger. The castle and manor. The home of the nobility was far more than a residence, it was a statement of power. A castle was a fortress, a seat of administration, and a symbol to all who saw it that the Lord held dominion over the land. In earlier centuries, these strongholds were often built of timber, surrounded by earthen walls and wooden palisades. By the High Middle Ages, stone castles rose across Europe, their towers and battlements dominating the landscape. Smaller nobles might reside in a manor house, still fortified but less imposing than a castle. The manor served as the administrative center for the surrounding lands, a hub for the collection of rents and dues, and the place where disputes were settled. Inside, noble dwellings varied in comfort. The Great Hall was the heart of daily life. A large, open space with a high timbered ceiling, dominated by a central hearth or large fireplace. Here, the lord dined with his household, received guests, and held court. Tapestries hung on the walls to insulate against the cold and to display wealth and heritage. A noble's responsibilities. A noble's life was not idle leisure, though it might seem so compared to the grueling labor of the peasantry. Nobles had a duty of governance over their lands and the people who lived on them. This included justice, presiding over disputes in the manor court, settling conflicts between tenants, and enforcing laws and customs. Protection, maintaining defenses, training retainers, and ensuring that the manor could withstand raids or sieges. Administration, overseeing the collection of rents and dues, managing estates, and maintaining relationships with other nobles and the crown. Military service. Answering the king's call to war, bringing their own armed retinues, and serving for a set number of days each year. Failing in these duties could mean loss of prestige, wealth, or even the land itself. The noble household. The household of a noble family was large and complex. In addition to the lord, lady, and their children, it included a retinue of servants, retainers, and specialists. Among them might be stewards to oversee the day-to-day running of the estate, chaplains to attend to the family's spiritual needs, knights and men-at-arms for defense, cooks, bakers, and brewers for preparing and storing food, stable hands for caring for horses, Ladies-in-waiting for the lady of the house. These individuals formed a small, interdependent community within the castle or manor walls. Education and upbringing. From a young age, noble children were groomed for their roles. Sons destined for knighthood began training as pages around age 7, learning basic skills of horsemanship, weapon handling, etiquette, and service to a lord or lady. By adolescence, they advanced to squires, serving directly under a knight and learning the practical and moral codes of chivalry. Around the age of 21, a squire might be knighted in a formal ceremony. Daughters of nobility were educated in skills suited to their expected roles, managing a household, supervising servants, embroidery, music, and the art of diplomacy through conversation. While some noble women wielded political power, especially as regents or landowners in their own right, their upbringing generally prepared them for strategic marriages that would strengthen alliances. Marriage and alliances. Marriage among the nobility was rarely about romance. It was a calculated tool of diplomacy, uniting families, consolidating lands, or forging political ties. A marriage contract could be as much a treaty as a personal union, often arranged while the parties were still children. Weddings were grand affairs, celebrated with days of feasting and entertainment. Dowries, gifts of land, money, or goods, were common, as were bride prices in some regions. Once married, the noble couple was expected to produce heirs to secure the family's legacy. Daily routine. While no two noble households were identical, a general rhythm can be imagined. Morning, the lord might meet with stewards or bailiffs to hear reports on the estate's operations. Letters and messages would be received and answered. The lady of the house might oversee domestic matters, the preparation of meals, the distribution of stores, or the management of servants. Midday, meals were taken in the great hall, sometimes privately with family, sometimes with guests or retainers. Noble fare included fresh bread, roasted meats, fish, cheese, and spiced dishes, accompanied by wine or ale. Afternoon, the lord might ride out to inspect lands, hunt, or train with his knights. Hunting was both a sport and a demonstration of skill, involving hawking, stag chases, or boar hunts. The lady might engage in embroidery, music, or the instruction of children and ladies-in-waiting. Evening, supper was often lighter than midday fare. Afterwards, there might be music, storytelling, games of chess or dice, or simply conversation by the fire. Feasts and hospitality. Hospitality was a noble duty. Traveling dignitaries, visiting knights, or even pilgrims could find shelter and food at a noble's hall. Feasts marked important occasions, a successful hunt, a wedding, a treaty, or a religious holiday. These banquets displayed the lord's wealth and generosity. Long trestle tables groaned under roasted meats, pies, stews, fresh bread, and sweets like honey cakes or spiced wine. Minstrels played, jugglers entertained, and toasts were given to honor guests. Hunting and leisure. Hunting was more than leisure, it was a training ground for war. Tracking game honed strategic thinking, horsemanship, and coordination. The nobles' hunting grounds were often strictly reserved, and poaching by peasants was harshly punished. Other pastimes included jousting, falconry, dancing, and attending tournaments, events that combined sport, spectacle, and political networking. The lady's role. While the lord was often occupied with war or governance, the lady of the house ensured the smooth running of the estate. She managed servants, oversaw food supplies, and kept household accounts. In her husband's absence, she could act as his representative, dispensing justice and making important decisions. Noble women also engaged in charitable acts, such as supporting local churches, funding religious festivals, and aiding the poor. Some became patrons of the arts, commissioning tapestries, illuminated manuscripts, or church decorations. Faith in the noble class. Religion was central to noble life. The day often began with prayers, and chapels within castles allowed for daily worship. Nobles funded churches and monasteries, sometimes as acts of piety, sometimes to display status. Many nobles took part in pilgrimages, journeying to holy sites to seek blessings or penance. Others joined or funded crusades, combining religious fervor with military ambition. The contrast with peasant life. Though nobles lived with far greater comfort and opportunity than peasants, they were not immune to hardship. War could claim their lives or devastate their lands. Political intrigue could strip away titles and estates. Disease spared no one, and the same winter cold that crept into a peasant's hut also seeped into the drafty stone walls of a castle. Still, the noble life offered a breadth of experience denied to most, the chance to shape events, to wield power, and to live surrounded by the symbols of prestige. An evening in the Great Hall. Imagine a winter's night in a noble's castle. Snow blankets the fields beyond the walls. Inside, the great hall glows with the light of many torches. The lord sits at the high table, his lady beside him, as platters of roasted venison and fresh-baked bread are carried in. Musicians play soft melodies on lutes and flutes. Knights, guests, and retainers laugh and talk over mugs of ale. Servants move quietly among the tables, refilling cups and clearing plates. The air is warm from the great hearth, and the scent of spiced wine mingles with wood smoke. Outside, the wind howls, but within these walls, there is comfort, community, and the unspoken knowledge that this household, for now, is secure. Part 5: Medieval Cities and Trade. For much of the early Middle Ages, Europe was a world of fields, forests, and small villages bound to the rhythms of agriculture. Yet by the High Middle Ages, a change was underway, slow at first, then quickening, as cities began to rise again, not as relics of the Roman past but as thriving centers of commerce, craftsmanship, and culture. These cities were magnets for people, goods, and ideas. They grew where trade routes converged, where rivers met the sea, where castles guarded bridges, and where markets had long been held. The return of vibrant urban life did not erase the rural foundations of medieval society, but it added a new dimension, one of bustling streets, crowded marketplaces, and the hum of workshops where goods were made by skilled hands. To understand medieval culture fully, we must leave the manor and the fields for a while and walk through the gates of a medieval city. The birth and growth of cities. Many medieval cities began as market towns, often established by a lord or a bishop who saw the value in attracting merchants and craftsmen. Markets might be held weekly, with fairs at set times of the year drawing traders from great distances. Some cities rose from the remnants of Roman towns, their ancient walls repaired and their central squares revived. Others grew up around castles or monasteries, their protection drawing settlers. A few began as river ports, where goods could be transferred from ship to cart, giving birth to a permanent settlement. By the 12th and 13th centuries, cities such as Paris, London, Venice, and Bruges had become major hubs of trade and influence. Smaller cities and towns dotted the landscape, each serving as a regional center for commerce and governance. City walls and gates. The first impression of a medieval city often came from its walls. Strong stone fortifications encircled the settlement, a legacy of a time when raiders or rival lords might appear with little warning. These walls were pierced by gates, often guarded and closed at night for security. Approaching a gate meant passing through a gatehouse, where travelers might be questioned and goods inspected. Merchants might pay a toll for the right to bring their wares inside. The gates themselves were often symbols of civic pride, decorated with carvings or statues. The streets within. Once inside the city, the visitor found narrow, winding streets, some paved with cobblestones, others little more than packed earth. Buildings crowded close together, their upper stories leaning over the street. Shops occupied the ground floors, while workshops and living quarters were above. The air was filled with smells, fresh bread from a baker's oven, the tang of tanned leather, the smoke of forges, and less pleasant odors from refuse and open drains. City life was noisy. The hammering of smiths, the cries of hawkers, the clatter of carts, and the tolling of church bells marking the hours. Markets and fairs. The marketplace was the beating heart of a medieval city. Here, traders set up stalls beneath colorful awnings, offering everything from fresh produce and meat to cloth, pottery, and tools. Merchants might display exotic goods brought from afar, spices from the east, fine silks, or furs from the northern forests. Fairs were larger, more festive events, often lasting several days. They drew merchants from distant lands and attracted entertainers, musicians, and food vendors. These gatherings were not only about trade, they were also occasions for news, matchmaking, and cultural exchange. Guilds and craftsmen. As cities grew, craft guilds emerged to regulate trades and protect their members. A guild set standards for quality, controlled prices, and oversaw the training of new craftsmen. Apprenticeships began young. A boy of 12 might be apprenticed to a master, living in his household and learning the trade over several years. Afterward, he became a journeyman, traveling from place to gain experience. Only after producing a masterpiece, a work that demonstrated skill and artistry, could he become a master and open his own shop. Guilds also played a social role, sponsoring religious festivals, caring for sick members, and supporting widows and orphans. Trade networks. Medieval trade was both local and long-distance. Cities exchanged goods with their surrounding countryside. Grain, vegetables, and meat came in, tools, cloth, and luxury goods went out. Long-distance trade linked cities across Europe and beyond. The Hanseatic League, a powerful network of merchant cities in northern Europe, dominated Baltic and North Sea trade. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa controlled Mediterranean routes, bringing in spices, sugar, and silk from the east. Trade fairs in places like Champagne in France served as meeting points for merchants from across the continent, connecting the markets of England, France, Italy, and the Low Countries. Daily life in the city. Life in a medieval city was fast-paced compared to the countryside. Craftsmen worked long hours in their shops, their families often helping with production. Merchants kept careful records of debts and deliveries. Street vendors hawked goods to passers-by. Homes were small by modern standards, often with multiple families sharing a single building. The wealthier citizens lived in larger timber-framed houses with glazed windows and painted walls. Public water sources, such as wells or fountains, were vital for daily needs, though many households also collected rainwater. Sanitation was a constant challenge. Waste was often thrown into the streets, leading to unpleasant conditions and the spread of disease. Religion and civic life. Churches were central to city life, both spiritually and socially. The cathedral, if the city had one, dominated the skyline with its spire or towers. Religious festivals filled the streets with processions, music, and decorations. Civic pride was strong. City councils or assemblies of wealthy merchants and guild leaders governed many towns, negotiating with kings or lords for rights and privileges. Some cities achieved the status of free cities, largely governing themselves in exchange for taxes or military support. Entertainment and culture. Cities offered diversions unknown to most villagers. Public squares hosted plays, markets, and tournaments. Inns and taverns provided food, drink, and gossip. Musicians, jugglers, and storytellers entertained crowds during fairs or feast days. Theaters were rare in early medieval cities but became more common later, often staging morality plays or biblical stories. Literacy rates were higher in cities than in rural areas, as trade and administration required reading and writing skills. Risks of city life. Urban living carried risks. Fires could sweep through crowded neighborhoods, disease could spread rapidly, and crime was a constant concern. The Black Death in the mid-14th century devastated city populations, sometimes killing more than half the residents in a matter of months. Yet the draw of opportunity outweighed the dangers for many. Cities offered the chance to escape the bonds of serfdom, to learn a trade, or to rise in wealth and influence. An evening in a medieval city. Imagine walking through a city at dusk. The market stalls are being packed away, their owners counting coins by candlelight. The smell of roasting meat drifts from an inn, mingling with the sharper scent of horses in the stables. Bells toll from the church tower, calling the faithful to evening prayers. In the narrow lanes, apprentices hurry home, while merchants lock their shop doors. Children chase one another in the fading light. From an open window above, the sound of a lute drifts into the street. The city, so alive by day, begins to quiet, its gates closing for the night, yet behind its walls, the hum of life never truly stops. Part 6: The Medieval Church. If feudalism was the political skeleton of the Middle Ages, the church was its soul. It was the ever-present force that touched every corner of life, from the moment of birth to the moment of death, from the humblest village to the grandest cathedral city. In an age when literacy was rare, political power fractured, and the world beyond one's own village seemed vast and unknowable, the church offered continuity, stability, and a shared belief that bound together kings and peasants alike. To understand medieval culture, it is impossible to separate it from the church, for religion was not confined to Sunday services or private devotion. It was a framework for law, education, art, architecture, morality, and even the calendar itself. The power of the church. In the Middle Ages, the church was both a spiritual and temporal power. Spiritually, it claimed authority over the salvation of souls, teaching that only through the sacraments could one enter heaven. Politically, it owned vast lands, commanded armies, collected taxes, and influenced the policies of kings. At its head stood the Pope in Rome, considered the successor of St. Peter. Beneath him was a hierarchy of cardinals, archbishops, bishops, and priests, each with authority over a region or parish. In many ways, the church's organization mirrored feudal society, with each rank owing loyalty to the one above. The parish and the local priest. For the average medieval person, the face of the church was the parish priest. He baptized newborns, officiated marriages, heard confessions, and conducted funerals. He was responsible for leading Mass each Sunday and on holy days, teaching the faith, and ensuring that the community observed the church's moral code. The parish church was often the largest and most important building in a village, constructed of stone when most homes were of wood. It stood as a symbol of permanence, with its bell calling people to worship or warning them of danger. Inside, walls might be painted with biblical scenes, offering a visual scripture to those who could not read. The sacraments. The church taught that there were 7 sacraments, sacred rites through which God's grace was conferred. Baptism, entry into the Christian community, usually soon after birth. Confirmation, affirming one's faith, typically in adolescence. Eucharist, receiving the consecrated bread and wine, believed to be the body and blood of Christ. Penance, confession of sins and receiving absolution. Matrimony, the sacred union of marriage. Holy orders, ordination into the priesthood. Extreme unction, also called the last rites, given to the dying. These sacraments were woven into the rhythm of life. One could not be fully part of the Christian community without participating in them. The church calendar. The medieval year was shaped by the church's liturgical calendar. Major feasts and seasons marked time. Advent and Christmas celebrated Christ's birth. Lent and Easter honored his death and resurrection. Saints' feast days dotted the year, often tied to local traditions and festivals. There were also numerous fasting days when meat and certain foods were forbidden, shaping what people ate and when. Tithes and taxes. The church's influence was not only spiritual. It was also a powerful landowner and economic force. Every household was expected to pay a tithe, usually 1/10 of its produce, to support the parish and its clergy. In addition, the church received donations and bequests from the faithful, sometimes in return for prayers for the donor's soul. These revenues funded church construction, supported monasteries, and, in some cases, were used for political purposes. The church's wealth made it both a respected institution and, at times, a target of resentment. Monasteries and monastic life. Monasteries were centers of spiritual devotion, learning, and economic activity. Monks and nuns lived under vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, following a strict daily routine of prayer, work, and study. The Benedictine rule, established in the 6th century, emphasized balance between labor and prayer, ora et labora, pray and work. Monasteries farmed their own land, brewed ale, made cheese, and produced manuscripts in their scriptoria, where scribes painstakingly copied texts by hand. Monasteries often served as hospitals, schools, and inns for travelers. In remote areas, they were vital centers of civilization, preserving knowledge through turbulent times. Pilgrimages. Pilgrimage was a central act of medieval devotion. The faithful traveled to holy sites to seek healing, penance, or spiritual renewal. Some pilgrimages were local, to the shrine of a regional saint. Others were epic journeys, to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Canterbury in England, or even to Rome or Jerusalem. Pilgrims often wore distinctive clothing or badges showing their destination, and towns along pilgrimage routes thrived from the trade and hospitality they provided. Cathedrals and architecture. The church's influence was etched into the very skyline. Cathedrals rose over cities in awe-inspiring displays of stone and glass. Romanesque cathedrals, with their thick walls and rounded arches, gave way to Gothic cathedrals with soaring spires, pointed arches, and vast stained-glass windows that bathed the interior in colored light. These buildings took decades, sometimes centuries, to complete. They were funded by bishops, wealthy patrons, and the contributions of ordinary townsfolk. Each cathedral was both a place of worship and a statement of the city's prestige. The Church and learning. The Church was the primary guardian of knowledge in the Middle Ages. Monastic schools educated boys in Latin, scripture, and the liberal arts. Later, cathedral schools grew into universities in cities like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. The curriculum was shaped by the Church, with theology at its center, but it also preserved and taught works of classical philosophy, law, and science. Scholars such as Thomas Aquinas sought to harmonize faith with reason, leaving a legacy that would shape European thought for centuries. The Church's political role. Kings and nobles often sought the Church's blessing to legitimize their rule. In return, the Church could influence policy, mediate disputes, or call for military campaigns such as the Crusades. Conflicts between church and state were frequent, especially over issues like the appointment of bishops. The investiture controversy of the 11th century, a dispute between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV, showed how deeply intertwined and contested spiritual and temporal power could be. Heresy and the Inquisition. The Church saw itself as the guardian of truth, and dissenting beliefs, labeled heresies, were considered dangerous not only to souls but to the social order. Movements such as the Cathars or the Waldensians challenged church teachings, leading to efforts to suppress them. The Inquisition was established to investigate and root out heresy. While sometimes offering the chance for repentance, it could also result in harsh punishments, including imprisonment or execution. Faith in everyday life. For the medieval person, faith was not a separate compartment of life, it was the air they breathed. Before setting out on a journey, one prayed for protection. Before a meal, one gave thanks. Disasters were interpreted through a religious lens, as divine punishment or testing. Church bells marked the hours of the day. The sight of a procession, the sound of Gregorian chant, the smell of incense, all were part of the sensory world of faith. An evening in a cathedral town. Picture a late autumn evening in a bustling town dominated by its cathedral. The day's market has ended, and the streets are quieter now. In the square, the great doors of the cathedral stand open, the golden glow of candles spilling onto the stone steps. Inside, the air is cool and smells faintly of beeswax and incense. A choir sings the evening office, their voices rising to the vaulted ceiling. Stained glass windows, dark now from the outside, gleam faintly from within, telling stories of saints and martyrs in colored light. Townsfolk kneel in prayer, some for thanksgiving, some in desperation. Outside, the bells begin to toll, echoing over rooftops and across the fields beyond the walls. The church, in all its grandeur and complexity, was not just a building, not just a hierarchy, it was the ever-present pulse of the medieval world, shaping how people lived, thought, and hoped. Part 7. Monastic Life. While the medieval world bustled with the noise of markets, the clang of blacksmiths' hammers, the shouts of merchants, and the hoofbeats of mounted knights, there existed another realm, quieter, enclosed, and ruled not by feudal lords but by the discipline of prayer and the rhythm of the bell. This was the world of the monastery. The monastery was not simply a retreat from society. It was a center of learning, a hub of charity, a guardian of the faith, and a place where men and women, monks and nuns, devoted their lives entirely to God. Behind its walls, time was measured not by the turning of the seasons alone, but by the steady cycle of worship, study, and labor. To step into a medieval monastery was to enter a microcosm of order in a world that could often feel chaotic. The calling to monastic life. Not everyone entered a monastery out of pure spiritual longing. Some did, drawn by the desire to live a life of prayer and contemplation. Others came because their families, especially those of the nobility, offered them to the church as children, sometimes as an act of devotion, sometimes to secure influence, or simply because the family had more heirs than they could provide for. Some joined later in life, seeking refuge after personal loss, war, or disillusionment with the world. Whatever the reason, the choice, or obligation, to enter monastic life was binding. Upon taking vows, a monk or nun dedicated their entire existence to the service of God. The structure of the monastery. Medieval monasteries varied in size and wealth, from small rural priories with a handful of monks to grand abbeys housing hundreds. Yet most followed a similar layout. The church, the spiritual heart, where the community gathered for the divine office and mass. The cloister, a square courtyard surrounded by covered walkways, connecting the main buildings and serving as a place for meditation. The chapter house, where monks met daily to read a chapter of the rule and discuss monastery business. The refectory, the dining hall, where meals were eaten in silence while a monk read aloud from scripture. The dormitory, shared sleeping quarters, often austere and unheated. The scriptorium, a workshop for copying manuscripts by hand. Workshops, barns, and gardens, supporting the monastery's self-sufficiency. Monasteries were designed for both communal life and quiet contemplation, with every space serving a purpose in the rhythm of the day. The Rule of Saint Benedict. While different monastic orders existed, the Rule of Saint Benedict was the most influential in Western Europe. Written in the 6th century, it emphasized a balance of ora et labora, prayer and work, along with obedience, humility, and stability. The Benedictine rule divided the day into periods of worship, manual labor, and study. Monks rose in the darkness before dawn for the first prayers, and their day was punctuated by the regular tolling of the bell, calling them to the divine office. The divine office. The central act of monastic life was the recitation of the divine office, 8 periods of prayer spaced throughout the day and night. Matins, in the deep night or early hours before dawn, a long service of psalms, readings, and prayers. Lauds, at dawn, praising God for the coming day. Prime, early morning, before the day's work began. Terce, mid-morning. Sext, midday. None, mid-afternoon. Vespers, evening prayer. Compline, final prayers before bed. This unbroken chain of worship ensured that the monastery's spiritual work never ceased. Daily labor. When not in prayer, monks and nuns worked. Labor was both a necessity and a spiritual discipline. Tasks varied by monastery, but common duties included agriculture, tending crops, orchards, and vineyards, raising livestock, brewing ale. Craftsmanship, carpentry, blacksmithing, and the production of goods for sale or trade. Charity, preparing food for the poor, caring for travelers, and operating infirmaries. Study and writing, copying manuscripts in the scriptorium, illuminating texts, and recording chronicles of local history. Monks saw physical labor as a way to honor God, and many monasteries became models of efficient farming and production. The scriptorium. One of the most celebrated aspects of medieval monastic life was the scriptorium, where books were copied by hand. In an age before printing, this was the only way to preserve texts. Monks worked with meticulous care, often in silence, hunched over desks with quills and ink. Religious works, Bibles, psalters, theological commentaries, were the most common, but monasteries also preserved classical works of philosophy, medicine, and science. Many manuscripts were decorated with elaborate illuminations. Gold leaf, vibrant pigments, and intricate designs that transformed the text into a work of art. Silence and discipline. Many orders required periods of strict silence, especially during the night, in the cloister, or in the refectory. Silence was believed to foster contemplation and guard against idle chatter or gossip. Discipline was enforced gently but firmly. A monk who broke a rule might be assigned penance, such as extra prayers, fasting, or public confession before the community. Food and meals. Meals in a monastery were simple but nourishing. Bread, vegetables, cheese, eggs, and fish formed the staples. Meat from four-legged animals was often restricted, though poultry and game might be eaten in some houses. Meals were eaten in silence, accompanied by readings from scripture or the lives of the saints. Fasting was frequent, especially during Lent and other penitential seasons. Hospitality and charity. Hospitality was a sacred duty. Monasteries offered shelter and food to travelers, pilgrims, and the poor. Some maintained guest houses, where visitors could stay without disturbing the rhythm of monastic life. In times of famine or war, monasteries often became vital centers of relief. Nunneries. Women also embraced monastic life, joining convents or abbeys as nuns. Like their male counterparts, nuns followed a rule, divided their day between prayer, work, and study, and took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Nunneries often provided education for girls, especially those from noble families. Some abbesses wielded considerable influence, managing large estates and acting as patrons of the arts. Monastic orders. While Benedictines were the most widespread, other orders flourished. Cistercians emphasized austerity, simplicity, and manual labor, often settling in remote areas. Cluniaces, known for their elaborate liturgy and rich artistic patronage. Carthusians combined communal life with hermit-like solitude. Franciscans and Dominicans, technically not monastics but mendicant friars, living in poverty and serving in towns and cities. Each brought a different emphasis to the monastic ideal. The monastery as a community anchor. Beyond its walls, the monastery was deeply connected to the surrounding world. It provided employment, purchased goods, offered medical care, and taught new agricultural techniques. Its bells marked time not only for the monks but for the surrounding countryside. In an age when kings might fall, borders might shift, and wars might sweep through the land, the monastery stood as a constant, a place where the psalms were sung at the same hour, the gardens tended in the same way, year after year. An imagined day in the cloister. Picture a monastery at dawn. The air is crisp, and a thin mist hangs over the cloister garden. The great bell tolls, calling the brothers to lauds. They move quietly through the covered walkways, their habits brushing against the stone, their footsteps echoing. In the church, candlelight flickers against carved wooden stalls as voices rise in chant, weaving Latin verses into the stillness. After prayers, some monks head to the fields, others to the scriptorium. The smell of fresh bread drifts from the bakehouse. At midday, they gather in the refectory, where a brother reads aloud as they eat. The afternoon is for more labor, then vespers at sunset. Compline ends the day, and the monastery grows quiet again, the silence deepened by the knowledge that in a few hours, the cycle will begin anew. Part 8, Education and Learning. When we think of medieval learning, it's easy to picture monks bent over manuscripts in candlelit scriptoria, slowly and carefully copying the words of long-dead authors. While this image is accurate for part of the Middle Ages, it tells only a fraction of the story. The medieval world, though often rural and rooted in tradition, nurtured its own forms of intellectual life. From the monastery school to the rise of great universities, from the preservation of ancient knowledge to the creation of new philosophical systems, education was a thread that wove through the fabric of the Middle Ages, though access to it was far from equal. It was a world in which books were rare treasures, teachers often wore clerical robes, and the highest intellectual pursuit was to unite faith and reason in a harmonious vision of the universe. The foundations of learning in the early Middle Ages. After the fall of Rome, Europe's network of public schools and libraries crumbled. Literacy rates fell, and much of the responsibility for education shifted to the church. Monasteries became the guardians of knowledge, preserving religious texts and, crucially, many works of classical antiquity. In these early centuries, monastic schools were the primary centers of learning. They trained not only monks but also boys destined for the priesthood. Instruction focused on Latin, the language of the church, as well as reading, writing, and basic religious instruction. Alongside monasteries, cathedral schools began to emerge in important cities. Founded by bishops, these schools prepared clergy for service in the church and often attracted students from the nobility. The 7 liberal arts. Medieval education was built around the framework of the 7 liberal arts, inherited from classical antiquity and adapted by early Christian thinkers. These were divided into 2 groups. The trivium, the foundational arts. Grammar, mastery of Latin and the ability to read and interpret texts. Rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking and writing. Logic, or dialectic, reasoning and argumentation. The quadrivium, the higher arts. 4. Arithmetic, the study of numbers. 5. Geometry, mathematical principles of space and form. 6. Music, not only performance but the mathematical theory of harmony. 7. Astronomy, the study of the heavens and their movements. This curriculum was not designed for practical trades but for forming a learned mind capable of theological and philosophical reasoning. Charlemagne and the Carolingian Renaissance. One of the most significant revivals of learning in the early medieval period came under Charlemagne in the late 8th and early 9th centuries. Determined to strengthen his empire through education, Charlemagne invited scholars from across Europe to his court, most famously the Englishman Alcuin of York. He established a network of schools in monasteries and cathedrals, standardized the teaching of Latin, and promoted the copying of texts. This period, known as the Carolingian Renaissance, did not reach the whole population, but it laid important groundwork for later intellectual developments. From schools to universities. By the 11th and 12th centuries, economic growth, urbanization, and the rediscovery of classical texts from the Islamic world fueled an intellectual revival often called the 12th century Renaissance. Cathedral schools grew in size and reputation, attracting students from across Europe. In some cities, groups of teachers and students formed associations, or universitates, to regulate study and protect their rights. These associations became the first universities. The earliest and most famous included University of Bologna, Italy, founded in 1088, renowned for law. University of Paris, France, founded c. 1150, famous for theology and philosophy. University of Oxford, England, founded c. 1096, grew into a major center for various disciplines. Universities operated under charters from the Pope or a king, giving them autonomy and special privileges. The life of a medieval student. Becoming a student in the Middle Ages was no small undertaking. Most students were young men, often between the ages of 14 and 20, who had already mastered basic Latin. They traveled to the city of their chosen university, sometimes from hundreds of miles away, carrying few possessions beyond clothing, writing materials, and perhaps a few books if they were wealthy. Classes were conducted in Latin, the shared scholarly language of Europe. Lectures consisted of a master reading from an authoritative text, Aristotle, the Bible, or a commentary, and explaining it line by line. Students were expected to memorize large portions and engage in disputation, formal debates testing their reasoning. Housing was often in rented rooms, and living conditions could be rough. Student life could be boisterous, with disputes between scholars and townspeople sometimes breaking into riots. Scholasticism. The dominant method of teaching and inquiry in the medieval university was scholasticism, a disciplined form of reasoning that sought to reconcile faith with logic. One of the towering figures of scholasticism was Thomas Aquinas, whose Summa Theologica attempted to systematize all of Christian theology using Aristotelian philosophy. For Aquinas and his peers, reason and revelation were not enemies but partners in the search for truth. Books and libraries. Books in the Middle Ages were rare and precious, each one copied by hand on parchment or vellum. A single manuscript could take months to produce, and the cost made them accessible only to institutions or the wealthy. Universities and monasteries maintained libraries, often guarded closely. Students usually read from a single copy of a text chained to a desk, copying notes by hand. The invention of paper, introduced from the Islamic world in the 12th century, gradually made books more affordable, but the real transformation would not come until the printing press in the 15th century. Education for women. While opportunities for women were limited, some received education in convent schools or through private tutors, particularly if they came from wealthy families. Noble women might learn reading, writing, music, and basic theology. A few women, such as Hildegard of Bingen, became renowned scholars, authors, and composers, though such cases were exceptional. Practical learning and guild training. Outside the formal academic world, education took the form of apprenticeships. Young people learned trades directly from masters in guilds, acquiring skills in carpentry, weaving, metalwork, or other crafts. This practical education was essential to urban economies and complemented the more theoretical studies of the universities. The transmission of knowledge. Medieval Europe owed much of its rediscovery of ancient learning to contact with the Islamic world. Through trade, crusades, and the translation movement in Spain and Sicily, works of Greek philosophy and science, preserved and expanded upon by Muslim scholars, entered Latin Europe. Texts by Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy, along with commentaries by figures such as Avicenna and Averroes, sparked new debates and discoveries. An imagined day at the university. Picture Paris in the 13th century. The streets around the university are crowded with students in long robes, their breath visible in the cold morning air. They gather in the lecture hall, a simple room with wooden benches, as the master enters. He opens a book of Aristotle, its heavy parchment pages carefully inked, and begins to read. The students listen, scribbling notes with quills, stopping now and then to argue a point or pose a question. After the lecture, they spill into the street, heading for disputations in a nearby hall. The air buzzes with debate, theology, law, medicine, all spoken in Latin so that a student from England can converse easily with one from Italy. In the evening, by the light of oil lamps, they review their notes, perhaps with a fellow student from another land. Beyond the university walls, the city hums with trade and tavern laughter, but here in the scholarly quarter, the work of learning continues, as it has for centuries. Part 9. Medieval Warfare and Knighthood. Medieval Europe was a world where power was often measured in the clang of steel and the number of armed men a lord could summon. While the Church preached peace and charity, the reality of the age was that disputes between kingdoms, noble families, and even neighboring villages were frequently settled by force. Warfare was not an occasional tragedy, it was a recurring fact of life. Amid this world of shifting alliances and territorial ambition rose a distinct warrior class, the knight. Armored in steel, mounted on powerful war horses, and bound, at least in theory, by the code of chivalry, knights became one of the most enduring symbols of the Middle Ages. But to understand them, we must look at the wider context of medieval warfare, from the organization of armies to the technologies that defined combat. The nature of medieval warfare. Medieval battles were rarely massive clashes between hundreds of thousands of men. Instead, they often consisted of smaller, targeted campaigns, raids, sieges, and skirmishes. Campaign seasons were dictated by the agricultural calendar, armies marched when the weather and harvests allowed, often in spring and summer, and returned home before winter. The goals of warfare varied: securing disputed borders, punishing rebellious vassals, defending trade routes, or asserting dynastic claims. Religious motives could also come into play, especially during the Crusades. The feudal levy. In the feudal system, a king or high lord called upon his vassals to provide a set number of days of military service each year. These vassals, in turn, summoned their own sub-vassals and retainers. This feudal levy could raise an army relatively quickly, but it was not a permanent force. Once their obligation was fulfilled, soldiers expected to return home. This meant that campaigns had to be planned within the limits of these service periods. A logistical challenge that sometimes led to drawn-out conflicts or abandoned sieges. The composition of armies. A medieval army was a diverse force, typically made up of knights, mounted warriors of noble birth, heavily armored and well-equipped. Men-at-arms, professional soldiers, some mounted, who might not be of noble rank but were skilled fighters. Infantry, peasant foot soldiers armed with spears, pikes, or bows. Archers, essential for both offense and defense, longbowmen and crossbowmen could turn the tide of battle. Specialists, engineers for siege works, sappers to undermine walls, and smiths to repair weapons and armor. Weapons and armor. Medieval weaponry evolved over the centuries. Swords, the knight's primary weapon, designed for slashing or thrusting depending on the style. Lances, long spears for mounted charges. Axes, maces, and war hammers, effective against armored opponents. Bows and crossbows, the longbow, in particular, could pierce armor at great distances. Armor also changed dramatically. Early medieval warriors wore chainmail, interlocking metal rings, over padded garments. By the late Middle Ages, plate armor emerged, offering greater protection but requiring immense craftsmanship. Helmets evolved from simple conical designs to fully enclosed visors. The castle as a military tool. The castle was both a defensive stronghold and a base for launching military campaigns. Strategically placed on high ground, near rivers, or along trade routes, castles allowed lords to control territory and resist sieges for months. Defenses included thick stone walls, towers for archers, gatehouses with portcullises, and moats. Attackers used siege towers, battering rams, trebuchets, and mining to breach walls. The art of the siege. Sieges were more common than open-field battles. An attacking army surrounded a fortress, cutting off supplies in hopes of forcing surrender. Siege engines, such as the trebuchet, hurled stones or incendiary materials over walls. Mangonels and ballistae launched projectiles, while sappers dug tunnels to collapse fortifications. Defenders responded with counterattacks, boiling oil, and their own missile fire. Sieges could last weeks or even years, causing immense hardship for those trapped inside. The rise of knighthood. Knighthood began as a military role for mounted warriors but evolved into a social class with its own ideals. A knight was expected to be skilled in combat, loyal to his lord, and, according to the code of chivalry, honorable and protective of the weak. Training began in childhood. At around age 7, a boy became a page, serving in a noble household, learning basic skills and manners. By his teens, he became a squire, serving a knight directly, caring for his armor and horse, and joining him in battle. Around age 21, a squire might be dubbed a knight in a ceremonial act, often after proving himself in combat or at a tournament. Chivalry and the knightly ideal. The chivalric code combined martial valor with Christian morality. It called for bravery, loyalty, generosity, and courtesy, especially toward women of noble birth. In reality, knights could be ruthless in war, but the ideal persisted in literature and culture. Epic poems and romances, tales of King Arthur, the Song of Roland, the deeds of crusading knights, shaped how knighthood was perceived for generations. Tournaments and justs. Outside of war, knights honed their skills in tournaments. These events were both sport and spectacle, drawing crowds from miles around. Early tournaments were chaotic mock battles, but over time, the joust became the centerpiece, two armored knights charging at each other with lances in a test of skill and courage. Victors could win prizes, ransom defeated opponents, and gain fame. The changing face of warfare. By the late Middle Ages, the nature of warfare began to shift. The introduction of gunpowder weapons, cannons and handheld firearms, slowly eroded the dominance of castles and plate-armored knights. Professional standing armies began to replace feudal levies, and infantry gained a more decisive role. An imagined battle scene. Picture a dawn before battle. The mist clings to the fields, muffling the sounds of preparation. Knights tighten the straps on their armor, their squires checking the fit of each plate. Horses snort and stamp, sensing the tension. Archers string their bows, while infantrymen grip spears worn smooth from use. The Lord rides down the line, offering words of encouragement. Trumpets sound, and the army begins to move. The clash, when it comes, is sudden and deafening, the thunder of hooves, the crack of lances, the ring of steel on steel. Above the chaos, banners whip in the wind, marking friend from foe. When the day ends, the field is strewn with the debris of war, broken shields, abandoned weapons, and the still forms of the fallen. Victory or defeat, the life of a medieval warrior was one of constant readiness, for peace could never be taken for granted. Part 10, Medieval Art and Architecture. The Middle Ages were not an age without beauty. While much of the period was defined by warfare, religion, and the cycles of agriculture, the medieval mind poured extraordinary skill, devotion, and imagination into art and architecture. The results still rise above city skylines in towering cathedrals, still glow in the pages of illuminated manuscripts, and still echo in the carved stone of cloisters and castles. Medieval art and architecture were not just for decoration. They were visual sermons, symbols of power, and statements of identity. They spoke to a largely illiterate population in a language of color, light, and form, telling the stories of the Bible, celebrating the saints, or glorifying the patrons who funded their creation. The Church as patron of the arts. The single greatest patron of medieval art was the Church. From the grandest cathedral to the smallest parish chapel, art was a tool for teaching and inspiring the faithful. Every sculpture, stained glass window, fresco, or painted panel had meaning. The Church's wealth, collected through tithes and donations, allowed it to commission large-scale projects. This patronage provided steady work for masons, painters, glaziers, and sculptors, and fostered a culture where religious art flourished. Styles of medieval architecture. Medieval architecture evolved through several distinct styles, each with its own character. Romanesque, c. 10th to 12th centuries. Romanesque buildings were massive, with thick stone walls, small rounded arch windows, and barrel-vaulted ceilings. They conveyed a sense of solidity and permanence. Examples include Cluny Abbey in France and Durham Cathedral in England. Gothic, c. 12th to 16th centuries. The Gothic style introduced soaring heights and an almost weightless quality, made possible by innovations such as the pointed arch, ribbed vault, and flying buttress. Cathedrals like Chartres, Notre Dame in Paris, and Cologne seemed to defy gravity, their interiors filled with colored light from enormous stained glass windows. The Gothic style was not merely structural, it was symbolic. The vertical lines and luminous interiors were intended to lift the mind toward heaven. Castles and secular architecture. Not all medieval architecture was religious. Castles and fortified manor houses were feats of engineering, blending defense with residence. Over time, castle design shifted from purely military to more comfortable living spaces, with larger windows, decorative stonework, and elaborate great halls. In towns, wealthy merchants built tall, narrow houses with ornate facades, often combining home and shop. Guild halls, town halls, and bridges also displayed civic pride through craftsmanship and design. Sculpture. Sculpture in the Middle Ages often adorned church portals, capitals, and cloisters. Figures of saints, apostles, and biblical scenes were carved in high relief, sometimes painted in vivid colors. The tympanum, the semicircular space above a church's main door, was a favorite site for dramatic depictions of the Last Judgment, meant to inspire awe and reflection as worshippers entered. Illuminated manuscripts. If Gothic cathedrals were the skyscrapers of the Middle Ages, illuminated manuscripts were its jewels. Produced in monasteries and later in urban workshops, these hand-copied books featured intricate borders, decorated initials, and miniature paintings enriched with gold leaf. Common subjects included the Book of Hours, a personal prayer book, psalters, and gospels. Each page was a work of art, combining text and imagery into a seamless whole. Stained glass. One of the most distinctive achievements of medieval art was stained glass. These windows were both decorative and didactic, telling biblical stories in radiant color to those who could not read. The great rose windows of Gothic cathedrals are masterpieces of geometry and symbolism, their light transforming the interior into a space that seemed touched by the divine. Painting. While few large-scale paintings survive from the early Middle Ages, wall paintings and frescoes decorated many churches and castles. They served both as ornament and instruction, illustrating the lives of saints, scenes from scripture, and moral allegories. Panel painting began to flourish in the later Middle Ages, especially in Italy, foreshadowing the Renaissance. Tapestries and textiles. Tapestries were both practical and decorative. Hung on the cold stone walls of castles and churches, they provided insulation as well as beauty. The Bayeux tapestry, technically an embroidered cloth, is one of the most famous, depicting the Norman conquest of England in vivid detail. Music as an art form. Music was also a major artistic expression. Gregorian chant, a form of plain chant, filled churches with unaccompanied, monophonic melodies. By the later Middle Ages, polyphony developed, adding harmonies and complexity. Secular music thrived in courts, with troubadours and minstrels composing songs of love, chivalry, and satire. Art beyond the church. While much medieval art was religious, secular themes existed, especially in illuminated manuscripts and tapestries. Scenes of daily life, hunting, feasting, and even humor appear alongside sacred images, showing the breadth of medieval imagination. The role of the artist. In the early Middle Ages, many artists were anonymous craftsmen, working in service to God rather than seeking personal fame. By the later period, especially in Italy, some artists began to sign their work, signaling the early stirrings of Renaissance individualism. An imagined day on the cathedral site. Picture a Gothic cathedral under construction in the 13th century. The site is alive with activity. Masons shape blocks of limestone with precise hammer blows. Carvers work on statues for the facade, saints, angels, and scenes from the Bible. A master glazier sketches the design for a new window, while apprentices grind pigments into powder. High above, carpenters balance on scaffolding, fitting timbers into the roof. The clang of tools echoes in the air, mingling with the smell of fresh mortar and sawdust. The work will take decades, perhaps more than a century, but each craftsman knows he is contributing to something that will outlast him, a stone testament to faith and human skill. Part 11: Music and Entertainment. While medieval life was full of labor, obligations, and the strict rhythms of feudal duty, it was not without joy, laughter, and artful expression. People sang in the fields, told stories in the evenings, gathered for festivals, and found countless ways to make life not just bearable, but vibrant. Music and entertainment in the Middle Ages served many purposes. They were expressions of faith, celebrations of love and valor, tools for storytelling, and means of binding communities together. Whether in the echoing nave of a cathedral or the rowdy bustle of a tavern, sound and performance were central to the medieval experience. Music in the sacred sphere. The church was the most important patron of music in the Middle Ages. Within its walls, music was not for idle pleasure but for worship, prayer, and the glorification of God. Gregorian chant. The most iconic form of medieval sacred music was Gregorian chant, named after Pope Gregory I, though it likely developed over centuries. Sung in Latin, unaccompanied, and monophonic, a single melodic line, it was designed to create an atmosphere of solemnity and contemplation. Chant was sung by choirs of monks, nuns, or clerics during the divine office in Massachusetts. Its melodies were carefully constructed to match the natural rhythm of the Latin text, flowing like a river without a strict beat. Polyphony. By the High Middle Ages, composers began experimenting with polyphony, the singing of multiple independent melodies at once. The Notre Dame School in Paris, with composers like Léonin and Periton, pioneered complex multi-voice compositions that transformed church music into something richer and more textured. Liturgical drama. Religious stories were sometimes acted out with music in liturgical dramas, performed within or near churches during feast days. These early plays, such as Quem Quaeritis, Whom Do You Seek?, blended theater and sacred music, making biblical narratives more vivid for audiences. Music in the secular world. Beyond the church, music thrived in courts, towns, and villages. Troubadours and trouvères. In southern France, troubadours composed and performed songs about courtly love, valor, and morality. Their northern counterparts were the trouvères. These poet-musicians were often nobles themselves, and their songs explored refined, idealized love, a love that was often unattainable, elevating the beloved to a near-spiritual status. Minnesingers. In the German-speaking lands, minnesingers performed similar roles, creating lyrical poetry set to music. They performed in noble courts and at festivals, weaving tales of chivalry and romance. Minstrels and jongleur. More itinerant were the minstrels and jongleur, professional entertainers who traveled from town to town. They sang songs, played instruments, juggled, told stories, and sometimes even performed acrobatics. Unlike the refined troubadours, jongleur catered to a broader audience, performing in marketplaces, inns, and during public celebrations. Medieval instruments. The medieval soundscape was created by a variety of instruments. String instruments, the lute, harp, psaltery, and vielle, a medieval fiddle. Wind instruments, the recorder, shawm, bagpipes, and flute. Percussion, drums, tambourines, bells, and cymbals. Organs, both large church organs and small portable ones. These instruments often accompanied dances, songs, or theatrical performances, adding rhythm and melody to social gatherings. Dance. Dancing was an important part of medieval festivities. Carols were popular, circle dances accompanied by singing. Basque dances were more formal courtly dances, slow and graceful, suited to noble gatherings. In villages, dancing was often spontaneous, breaking out during fairs, weddings, or after the completion of a successful harvest. Storytelling and oral tradition. In a largely illiterate society, storytelling was a vital form of entertainment and cultural transmission. Epics like the Song of Roland in France, Beowulf in England, and the Nibelungenlied in Germany were recited or sung to audiences, sometimes accompanied by music. Fables, legends, and folk tales, often with moral lessons, were told by firesides in cottages or around communal gatherings. These stories bound communities together, preserving local history and values. Theater and performance. By the later Middle Ages, theater had moved beyond the church to become a public spectacle. Mystery plays and morality plays were staged in town squares, often sponsored by guilds. Mystery plays dramatized biblical events, while morality plays personified virtues and vices, teaching moral lessons through allegory. These performances could be elaborate, with costumes, stage machinery, and large casts drawn from the community. Festivals and public celebrations. Festivals were some of the most anticipated events of the year. They marked religious feasts, seasonal changes, royal visits, or victories in battle. Common features included music and dancing in the streets, parades with banners, floats, and costumed participants, games and competitions such as archery contests, wrestling, and foot races, feasting on special foods not usually part of the daily diet. In some festivals, the usual order of society was playfully inverted. The Feast of Fools, for instance, allowed lower clergy to parody their superiors and ordinary townsfolk to mock authority. Tournaments as entertainment. While primarily a martial sport, tournaments were also major entertainment events. The joust, melee battles, and displays of knightly skill drew large crowds. These occasions were as much about socializing and showing off wealth and heraldry as they were about combat. The role of entertainment in medieval society. Entertainment served to strengthen bonds within the community, to transmit values and traditions, and to offer relief from the hardships of life. In a world where survival often demanded long hours of labor, moments of music, dance, and celebration were vital for morale. An imagined festival evening. Imagine arriving at a town square during a summer fair. Stalls are lit with flickering torches, selling spiced wine, sweet pastries, and grilled meats. A circle of dancers moves to the lively tune of shawms and drums, their shadows leaping on the cobblestones. Nearby, a troubadour sings a ballad of a knight's unrequited love, his voice rising above the chatter. A juggler tosses flaming torches to the delight of a ring of children. In the distance, the bells of the parish church mark the hour, but no one is in a hurry to go home. Tonight is for music, stories, and laughter, a reminder that even in an age of hardship, joy was never forgotten. Part 12, Food and Feasting. In the medieval world, food was never just food. It was a daily necessity, a marker of social status, a subject of law and religion, and, on special occasions, a dazzling display of wealth and hospitality. For most people, meals were humble and repetitive, shaped by the rhythm of the seasons and the limits of local resources. But for the nobility and on feast days, dining could become an event that blended artistry, pageantry, and abundance. To understand medieval culture, one must understand its food, not only what people ate, but how they prepared it, when they ate it, and what these meals meant in the broader social and cultural context. The medieval diet. Medieval diets varied dramatically by class, geography, and season. For the peasantry, the staple food for most was bread, often made from rye, barley, or oats. Wheat bread, lighter and whiter, was preferred but more expensive. Bread was usually accompanied by pottage, a thick, slow-cooked stew of vegetables like cabbage, leeks, onions, and beans, sometimes enriched with herbs, grains, or a bit of meat if available. Milk, butter, and cheese were common, especially from cows, goats, or sheep. Eggs were eaten when available, and in fishing regions, fresh or salted fish formed an important part of the diet. Ale was the everyday drink, providing calories and hydration when water could be unsafe. For the nobility, the noble table was far more varied. Bread was made from fine white wheat flour. Meat was abundant: beef, pork, venison, rabbit, and game birds such as pheasant or swan. Fish was eaten frequently, especially on fasting days, and might include sturgeon, eel, or herring. Nobles enjoyed spices such as cinnamon, cloves, and pepper, imported from distant lands. These were expensive and therefore powerful symbols of status. Sweet and savory were often combined. Meats might be cooked with fruit, honey, and spices in elaborate sauces. Meals and mealtimes. Most people ate two main meals a day, a late morning dinner and an evening supper. Breakfast, when taken, was light: bread, cheese, or ale. In noble households, meals were highly structured events. The lord and lady dined at a high table, elevated above the rest of the hall. Below them sat the rest of the household, arranged according to rank. Servants and retainers ate separately, often after the main household had finished. Cooking methods. Open hearths were the primary cooking spaces. In peasant homes, these were in the center of the main room, with pots hung over the fire. Baking was often done in communal ovens, as private ovens were rare. In noble kitchens, often separate from the main hall for safety, cooking was an organized, large-scale operation. Roasting was common for meats, either on spits turned by hand or by mechanical devices powered by water or animals. Boiling, baking, frying, and stewing were all practiced. Sauces and seasonings were prized, not merely to mask spoilage, a common myth, but to enhance flavor and demonstrate refinement. Feasts and banquets. Feasts were among the most spectacular events in medieval society. They celebrated weddings, religious festivals, coronations, victories in battle, or visits from important guests. A grand feast was an orchestrated performance. Courses might include soups, roasted meats, pies, fish, pastries, and desserts, often accompanied by subtle visual tricks. Subtleties were elaborate edible sculptures made from sugar, marzipan, or pastry, designed to amaze guests, castles, ships, or animals crafted with painstaking detail. Music and entertainment accompanied the meal, with minstrels, dancers, and jesters performing between courses. Ceremonial service emphasized hierarchy. The Lord was served first, with the choicest cuts and finest dishes. Banquets could last for hours, with dozens of dishes brought in procession. Table manners. Medieval table manners were governed by elaborate rules, especially among the upper classes. Diners used knives, spoons, and their fingers. Forks were rare in most of Europe until later in the Middle Ages. Food was often served on trenchers, thick slices of bread that absorbed juices and could be eaten afterward or given to the poor. Guests were expected to wash their hands before and after eating, avoid taking more than their share, and never drink from the communal cup before wiping it. Food and religion. The church exerted great influence over diet. Fasting days, especially during Lent, restricted the consumption of meat, dairy, and sometimes eggs. Fish was permitted and became central to many fasting meals. Religious feasts were also occasions for abundance. Christmas, Easter, and saints' days brought out the best a household could offer, even in peasant villages. Preservation and storage. Without refrigeration, medieval people relied on preservation methods. Salting and smoking meats and fish. Drying fruits, herbs, and grains. Pickling vegetables in vinegar or brine. These methods were essential for surviving the winter months when fresh produce was scarce. Markets and trade. Markets were vital for supplying food. In towns and cities, open-air markets sold fresh bread, meat, fish, vegetables, and spices. In rural areas, fairs provided opportunities to buy goods not produced locally. Long-distance trade brought exotic spices, dried fruits, sugar, and wine from afar, making them luxury items for the wealthy. An imagined banquet. Imagine a great hall lit by dozens of torches and a roaring central fire. The tables are covered with white cloths, pewter plates, and polished goblets. Servants move among the guests, carrying platters of roasted venison glazed with honey, pies filled with spiced pork and apples, and trenchers piled with steaming vegetables. A subtlety is brought in, a sugar castle with banners fluttering, so finely crafted it seems a shame to eat it. Musicians play lutes and flutes in the corner, their melodies mingling with the murmur of conversation and the laughter of guests. The Lord raises his cup, offering a toast, and the hall echoes with cheer. Outside, the night is cold and dark, but inside the feast is warm, bright, and alive, a celebration not only of plenty but of fellowship. Part 13, Clothing and Fashion. In the medieval world, clothing was far more than a way to keep warm or protected. It was a language, one that spoke of a person's rank, occupation, wealth, region, and even moral character. Fabrics, colors, cuts, and accessories all carried meaning, and in a society where social hierarchy was rigid, what you wore could determine how you were treated. For the wealthy, fashion was an ever-changing canvas of self-expression and status display. For the poor, clothing was durable and practical, designed for work rather than show. Yet in both castle and cottage, garments were made with care, reflecting the skills of tailors, weavers, and embroiderers. The role of clothing in medieval society. Medieval clothing was inseparable from social structure. One could often tell at a glance if a person was a noble, a merchant, a peasant, or a monk. Laws called sumptuary laws even dictated who could wear certain fabrics or colors, reinforcing the idea that clothing should reflect one's place in the hierarchy. Fabrics and materials. The choice of fabric was the most immediate indicator of status. Wool was the most common material for all classes, from coarse homespun for peasants to fine, tightly woven cloth for the wealthy. Linen was used for undergarments and summer clothing. It was lighter and cooler than wool. Silk was a luxury imported from the East, available only to the wealthiest nobles and clergy. Fur provided warmth and decoration. Ermine, sable, and vair were prized by the elite, while sheepskin or rabbit were more affordable. Weaving was done on large looms, often in households or by specialized artisans in towns. Colors and dyes. Natural dyes gave medieval clothing its colors. Woad and indigo for blue. Madder root for red. Walnut husks for brown. Saffron for yellow. Bright, richly saturated colors were expensive, as they required more dye and better quality fabric to hold the pigment. Purple, associated with royalty since antiquity, remained rare and prestigious. Clothing for the peasantry. Peasant clothing was designed for hard labor. Men wore tunics of coarse wool or linen, belted at the waist, with hose, or simple trousers. Women wore long woolen dresses with aprons, sometimes layered with a short overgown. Garments were mended repeatedly, often patched and handed down. Footwear was basic. Leather shoes or boots, sometimes wooden clogs. In cold weather, cloaks and hoods offered protection from the elements. Clothing for the nobility. The nobility could afford garments of finer cut and richer materials. Men wore long tunics or surcoats over hose, often richly embroidered, with fur-lined mantles in winter. By the later Middle Ages, fitted doublets and hose became fashionable. Women wore long gowns with tight-fitting bodices and wide, flowing sleeves. Veils, wimples, or elaborate headdresses covered the hair, and gowns were often lined or trimmed with fur. Noble clothing was also seasonal, lighter silks and linens for summer, heavy wools and furs for winter. Headwear. Head coverings were essential for both practical and social reasons. Peasant men might wear simple caps or hoods. Peasant women often wore kerchiefs or veils. Noblemen might sport hats with feathers or decorative bands. Noblewomen in the later Middle Ages wore elaborate headdresses such as the hennin, a tall, cone-shaped hat often draped with gauze. Headwear could signify marital status. A married woman was expected to cover her hair, while an unmarried woman might wear it loose. Accessories and jewelry. Accessories further marked wealth and taste. Belts were functional for carrying pouches, knives, or tools, but among the wealthy they could be ornate, with metal fittings and embroidery. Jewelry included rings, brooches, and pendants. Precious stones were set in gold or silver, often with symbolic meaning, sapphires for purity, rubies for passion. Purses and girdle pouches were necessary, as clothing had no pockets. Armor as clothing. For knights and soldiers, armor was as much a display of identity as a defensive necessity. Surcoats bore coats of arms, and elaborate helms could be crested with decorative plumes or figures, making the wearer instantly recognizable on the battlefield or at a tournament. Children's clothing. Children were often dressed as miniature versions of adults, though their clothing allowed for growth and ease of movement. Wealthy families might provide richly decorated garments for special occasions, while everyday clothing remained practical. Tailoring and production. While peasants often made their own garments from homespun cloth, the wealthy relied on professional tailors. Cloth was expensive, so garments were cut carefully to minimize waste. In towns, cloth merchants and tailors formed guilds, regulating quality and prices. Fashion trends. Fashion was not static. In the 14th century, tighter-fitting garments became popular among men, showing the outline of the body more clearly. Women's gowns became more elaborate, with trailing sleeves and skirts. By the 15th century, styles grew increasingly extravagant at court, with padded shoulders, slashed sleeves showing contrasting fabric beneath, and elaborate patterns woven into the cloth. An imagined day at a noble wedding. Picture a courtyard filled with guests arriving for a noble wedding. The peasantry wears their best, tunics freshly washed, aprons clean, cloaks clasped with simple brooches. Merchants sport bright, well-dyed garments, their belts hung with pouches and keys. The nobility glitter in silk and velvet, fur-lined mantles sweeping the ground. Women wear jeweled girdles and headdresses that tower like crowns. Men display embroidered surcoats over fitted hose, their daggers sheathed in ornamented belts. Sunlight catches on gold thread, polished buckles, and the sparkle of gemstones. Every stitch, every color, every piece of cloth speaks not just of personal taste but of social place, a visible map of the medieval order, woven into fabric and worn for all to see. Part 14. Health and Medicine. Health in the medieval world was a fragile thing. A scratch from a rusty tool could fester into a life-threatening infection, childbirth was perilous for both mother and child, and diseases could sweep through entire towns with devastating speed. Without modern germ theory, antibiotics, or advanced surgical techniques, medieval medicine relied on a blend of ancient theories, herbal remedies, religious rituals, and a growing, though still limited, body of practical experience. It was a world where physicians might quote Aristotle and Galen as easily as they prescribed a poultice of rosemary, and where a prayer to a saint could be considered as important as any physical treatment. Understanding how medieval people cared for their health is to step into a world where science, superstition, and spirituality intertwined. The framework of medieval medicine. The medical knowledge of medieval Europe was built largely on the writings of ancient Greek and Roman physicians, especially Hippocrates and Galen, preserved and expanded upon by scholars in the Islamic world before returning to the Latin West through translation. At the heart of medieval medical theory was the humoral system. According to this belief, the body contained 4 humors: blood, hot and wet; phlegm, cold and wet; yellow bile, hot and dry; black bile, cold and dry. Health was seen as a balance among these humors. Illness arose from imbalance, and treatment aimed to restore harmony, often through diet, herbal remedies, or purging techniques such as bloodletting. Types of medical practitioners. Healthcare in the Middle Ages came from a variety of sources, each with different levels of training and respectability. Physicians, university-trained, often serving the wealthy. They diagnosed illness based on symptoms, humoral theory, and astrological charts. Surgeons, considered craftsmen rather than scholars, they performed procedures such as setting bones, stitching wounds, or amputations. Barber surgeons provided both grooming and basic surgery. Their poles symbolized the red, blood, and white bandages of their trade. Apothecaries prepared and sold medicines, often using herbs, minerals, and animal products. Wise women and folk healers relied on traditional remedies and charms, serving rural communities where professional doctors were scarce. Hospitals. Medieval hospitals were different from modern ones. They were often run by religious orders and served more as places of rest and care than centers for curing disease. Patients might receive food, shelter, and prayers, but advanced medical treatment was rare. Monasteries often had infirmaries for sick monks and sometimes cared for travelers or the poor. Urban hospitals developed later, funded by charitable donations. Herbal remedies. Plants formed the backbone of medieval medicine. Herbal knowledge was passed down through generations, recorded in manuscripts called herbals. Common remedies included willow bark for pain, a precursor to aspirin; garlic for infections and digestive issues; mint for stomach ailments; rosemary for memory and circulation. Many treatments were based on the doctrine of signatures, the belief that a plant's appearance indicated its use, for example, lungwort for lung disease because its spotted leaves resembled lung tissue. Diet and regimen. Preventative medicine emphasized a healthy lifestyle according to the 6 non-naturals: air, food and drink, exercise and rest, sleep and waking, excretions, and mental state. Diet was considered crucial to balancing the humors, with certain foods classified as hot, cold, moist, or dry. Wealthier individuals had access to varied diets, but peasants' diets were often limited, which could lead to deficiencies. Astrology and medicine. Astrology played a significant role in diagnosis and treatment. Physicians consulted star charts to determine the most favorable times for surgery, bloodletting, or administering medicines. It was believed that the positions of celestial bodies could influence health by affecting the humors. Surgery. Surgical techniques were rudimentary and risky, given the lack of anesthesia, beyond alcohol or herbal sedatives, and antiseptics. Surgeons performed amputations, removed arrowheads, and treated wounds. Trepanation. Drilling a hole in the skull to relieve pressure was sometimes attempted for head injuries. In battlefield conditions, quick treatment could mean the difference between life and death, though infection often claimed patients later. Epidemics and public health. Medieval Europe faced recurring epidemics, the most infamous being the Black Death, 1347 to 1351, which killed an estimated one-third to one-half of Europe's population. Causes were not understood. Some blamed miasmas, bad air, others divine punishment. Responses included processions, fasting, and the persecution of scapegoated groups. Cities began to develop rudimentary public health measures, such as quarantines and waste removal, though sanitation remained poor. Childbirth and women's health. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous events in a woman's life. Midwives attended births, relying on experience, herbal aids, and prayers. Infant and maternal mortality rates were high. Women's health was often discussed in separate treatises, with a mix of practical gynecological advice and deeply ingrained societal and religious attitudes. Mental health. Conditions we might now classify as mental illness were often explained in religious terms, as demonic possession, divine punishment, or moral failing. Treatments ranged from prayer and confession to herbal sedatives, though some monasteries provided compassionate care for the mentally ill. Superstition and spiritual healing. Medicine was deeply intertwined with religion. Prayers, pilgrimages, and relics of saints were sought for healing, sometimes alongside physical remedies. Holy water, blessed oil, or charms might be given to patients. Superstitious practices included wearing amulets, inscribing protective symbols, or using magical incantations, blurring the lines between faith, folklore, and medicine. An imagined day in a medieval infirmary. Picture a monastery's infirmary on a cool spring morning. Light filters through narrow windows, falling on rows of wooden beds. Monks move quietly among the sick, bringing bowls of warm broth. In one corner, an apothecary grinds dried herbs with a mortar and pestle, mixing a remedy for a feverish patient. A surgeon sets a broken arm, binding it with linen strips. The air smells of rosemary, vinegar, and beeswax. Outside, the chapel bell rings, and the monks pause in their work to offer a brief prayer before returning to their patients. In this place, care is as much about the soul as the body, an act of mercy in a world where recovery is never certain. Part 15, Law and Justice. In the medieval world, law was not an abstract system tucked away in dusty books, it was a living, breathing force woven into the daily fabric of life. It shaped how disputes were resolved, how crimes were punished, and how society maintained order in an era without centralized police forces or modern prisons. Law and justice varied greatly between kingdoms, regions, and even villages, but at their heart, they reflected the medieval worldview, a world of hierarchy, custom, and deep interconnection between secular and spiritual authority. To understand medieval law is to understand that it was not only about rules, but about relationships, between lords and vassals, between rulers and subjects, between God and man. The foundations of medieval law. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of overlapping legal systems. Feudal law governed the relationships between lords and vassals, including land disputes, obligations, and inheritance. manorial law applied to peasants and covered local matters such as farming rights, property boundaries, and small-scale crimes. Royal or common law was issued by kings or central authorities, becoming increasingly influential as monarchies grew stronger. Canon law, administered by the Church, regulated marriage, morality, inheritance, and the behavior of clergy. A single person might be subject to more than one legal authority. For example, a noble could face the king's justice for treason but the Church's judgment for heresy. Local justice, the manor court. For most peasants, justice was dispensed at the manor court, presided over by the local lord or his steward. These courts met regularly, sometimes every few weeks, to resolve disputes and enforce manorial customs. Cases could involve disagreements over land boundaries, failure to perform required labor for the lord, damage to crops or livestock, petty theft or public disorder. Punishments were often fines or the forfeiture of goods, since imprisoning peasants was impractical, their labor was too valuable. The court also recorded important events like transfers of land or changes in tenancy. Trial by ordeal. In the earlier Middle Ages, one form of justice was the trial by ordeal, the belief that God would reveal the truth by protecting the innocent. Common ordeals included ordeal by fire, carrying a hot iron a set distance, with healing of the burn taken as proof of innocence. Ordeal by water, being thrown into water, sinking meant innocence, floating meant guilt. Paradoxically, floating was considered rejection by the pure water. Ordeal by combat, a formal duel in which the victor was presumed to have God's favor. By the 13th century, such ordeals began to fall out of favor, especially as church authorities discouraged them, and more rational forms of evidence gained importance. Royal and common law. In England, the development of common law under kings like Henry II, 12th century, created a more unified legal system. Royal judges traveled on circuit to hear cases, and legal precedents built over time. This system, based on recorded decisions, became a defining feature of English law and influenced legal traditions far beyond the Middle Ages. In other regions, royal courts evolved differently, sometimes blending local customs with written codes. In France, for example, Roman law resurfaced in the south, while customary law remained dominant in the north. The role of the Church, canon law. The Church wielded its own legal authority through canon law. It covered religious offenses, marriage disputes, wills, and issues involving clergy. Ecclesiastical courts could excommunicate offenders, deny them the sacraments, or impose penance. Clerics accused of crimes often claimed benefit of clergy, meaning they could be tried in church courts, which tended to give lighter punishments than secular ones. Punishments. Punishments in the medieval world varied widely depending on the offense, the offender's status, and the region. They included fines, the most common, especially for lesser crimes. Public humiliation, such as the stocks or pillory. Corporal punishment, whipping, branding, or mutilation, like ear cropping. Execution, for serious crimes such as murder, treason, or heresy. Methods included hanging, beheading, and burning. Execution was often public, intended to deter others and reinforce authority. Prisons. Prisons were generally holding places for those awaiting trial or punishment, rather than long-term sentences. Noble prisoners might be kept in relative comfort, sometimes even allowed visitors and servants, while common criminals endured harsh conditions. Oaths and witnesses. Sworn oaths were central to medieval justice. The credibility of an oath could depend on the social status of the person swearing it, and witnesses might be required to vouch for the character of the accused. In small communities, reputation was crucial. A history of good conduct could tip the balance in one's favor. Guild and town justice. In growing towns and cities, guilds and municipal governments developed their own courts to handle disputes among members or enforce trade regulations. These urban courts often reflected the more commercial concerns of merchants and craftsmen. Law enforcement. There were no standing police forces as we know them today. Local constables or reeves were responsible for keeping order, raising the hue and cry when a crime occurred, and organizing the pursuit of criminals. Communities were expected to police themselves, and failure to respond to a call for help could result in fines. Justice for the nobility. Nobles accused of serious crimes might be tried in higher courts or by their peers. Trials could be highly political affairs, with outcomes influenced by alliances, family power, and royal favor. In some cases, disputes between nobles were resolved through formal combat. An imagined scene, the manor court in session. It is a crisp autumn morning, and villagers gather in the open space before the manor hall. The Lord's steward sits at a long wooden table, a scribe beside him to record the proceedings. A farmer accuses his neighbor of letting pigs trample his barley field. The accused denies it, swearing on the Gospels. Witnesses are called, and after much debate, the steward orders the offender to pay a fine in grain. A young man is brought forward for stealing a loaf of bread from the Lord's bakehouse. He admits his guilt and is sentenced to a day in the stocks, where villagers may jeer, but also perhaps slip him a scrap of food. The court moves on to its next case, the business of law woven seamlessly into the life of the community. Part 16, Travel and Pilgrimages. In an age before railways, airplanes, and paved highways, travel in the medieval world was a challenging, sometimes dangerous, but often profoundly meaningful endeavor. For many, life unfolded within the boundaries of a village or manor, and the horizon was as much a limit of possibility as it was a line of sight. Yet people did travel, for trade, for war, for royal duty, for love, for escape, and perhaps most importantly for God. Pilgrimages, in particular, could carry a person hundreds or even thousands of miles from home. These journeys combined the physical hardship of medieval travel with the deep spiritual rewards promised by reaching a holy destination. To walk the roads and ride the paths of the Middle Ages is to step into a slower, riskier, but surprisingly interconnected world. Why people traveled. The motivations for travel in the medieval period were as varied as the travelers themselves. Pilgrimage, journeys to holy sites to seek blessings, healing, or penance. Trade, merchants moving goods between towns, fairs, and ports. War and service, soldiers, knights, and their retainers riding to campaigns or tournaments. Learning, students traveling to universities or renowned teachers. Political duties, messengers, diplomats, and royal envoys on official business. Seasonal labor, workers moving to where harvests or building projects needed extra hands. Crusades, long military expeditions to the Holy Land, blending warfare and religious devotion. The roads and routes. Travel infrastructure varied greatly. Some regions still benefited from the remnants of Roman roads, well-engineered stone routes that had endured for centuries. Elsewhere, paths were dirt tracks prone to becoming muddy quagmires in wet weather. Bridges were often narrow and made of wood. In their absence, travelers forded rivers, which could be treacherous during floods. Ferries provided passage across larger bodies of water. Major trade routes and pilgrimage roads became better maintained through use and cooperation among towns, though local lords sometimes charged tolls at bridges or gates. Modes of travel. On foot, the most common means, especially for the poor. Pilgrims and laborers often walked hundreds of miles, carrying their possessions on their backs. Horseback, faster and more comfortable for those who could afford it. Nobles, messengers, and soldiers relied on horses. Carts and wagons, used for goods or group travel, though slower than horseback. By ship, coastal and river travel could bypass dangerous or slow overland routes. Merchant cogs and fishing vessels often carried passengers. Dangers of the road. Travel was not without risk. Bandits lurked in forests and remote stretches. Wolves and other wild animals could threaten lone travelers. Political instability could make certain regions unsafe. To mitigate danger, travelers often banded together in groups. Pilgrims, merchants, and soldiers might share the road, providing safety in numbers. Towns sometimes organized patrols on busy routes. Inns and hospitality. Accommodations for travelers ranged from inns in towns to monasteries offering shelter for the night. Inns provided food, ale, and a place to sleep, though comfort varied widely. Some were rowdy places frequented by gamblers and thieves, others catered to respectable guests. In rural areas, monasteries and abbeys played a crucial role in hospitality. Following the Christian tradition of aiding the stranger, monastic guesthouses welcomed travelers, pilgrims, and the poor, offering simple meals and a bed. Pilgrimage, the journey of the soul. Pilgrimage was one of the most significant forms of medieval travel. A pilgrim might set out for many reasons. To fulfill a vow, to seek healing for illness, to do penance for sins, or to express devotion. Destinations included local shrines, perhaps a saint's relic in a nearby church. Regional holy sites, such as Canterbury Cathedral in England, the Shrine of St. James at Santiago de Compostela in Spain, or the Tomb of St. Peter in Rome. The Holy Land, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and other sacred places, though these required long, costly, and dangerous journeys. The pilgrim's outfit. A pilgrim's attire was distinctive: a simple tunic, a wide-brimmed hat for sun and rain, a sturdy staff for walking, and a satchel for food and belongings. Many carried a badge or token showing their destination, a scallop shell for Santiago, for example, which also served as proof of their journey. Life on the Pilgrim Road. Pilgrims traveled in mixed company, nobles seeking prestige, peasants seeking healing, merchants combining devotion with business. The road was a place of constant encounter with other pilgrims, with locals selling goods or services, with musicians, beggars, and preachers. Along the way, chapels, shrines, and way stations catered to pilgrims' needs. Fairs often sprang up at major pilgrimage centers, turning them into bustling hubs of trade. Spiritual rewards. Reaching the destination was both a physical and spiritual triumph. Pilgrims prayed at relics, attended Mass, and sometimes received certificates proving their completion of the journey. Many believed the pilgrimage cleansed them of sin or brought divine favor for themselves or loved ones. Trade and pilgrimage intersect. Pilgrimage routes often doubled as trade corridors. Merchants set up shop along the way, selling food, clothing, charms, and souvenirs. This intersection of commerce and devotion helped grow towns and shape regional economies. An imagined pilgrim's day. Picture a spring morning on the road to Santiago de Compostela. The air is cool, the sun rising over rolling hills. A group of pilgrims sets out together, a merchant from Flanders, a widow from Bordeaux, two young brothers from England. Their boots crunch on the gravel path as they pass vineyards and small chapels. By midday, they stop at a roadside shrine to rest and share bread, cheese, and dried figs. The talk is of the road ahead, of rumors of bandits near a bridge, of the saint's miracle said to await at Santiago. As the sun sets, they reach a small town, where a monastery's guesthouse offers them straw-filled mattresses and a simple stew. After prayers, they sleep, ready to continue the long road tomorrow. Part 17, The Crusades. The Crusades were among the most dramatic, far-reaching, and transformative events of the medieval period. They were not a single war but a series of military expeditions, religious campaigns, and cultural exchanges spanning nearly 2 centuries, beginning in the late 11th century and echoing long after. To medieval Europeans, they were framed as holy missions. Journeys taken up under the banner of the cross to reclaim sacred lands, defend Christendom, or combat perceived enemies of the faith. To those who lived through them, the Crusades were both deeply spiritual and brutally worldly, blending fervent devotion with political ambition, personal glory, and the allure of distant lands. To walk through the world of the Crusades is to step into a realm where faith and steel intertwined, where papal decrees carried armies across continents, and where the encounter of East and West reshaped art, science, trade, and thought for centuries. The call to crusade. The spark for the First Crusade was lit in 1095, when Pope Urban II addressed a crowd at the Council of Clermont in France. Reports had reached the West that Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land were suffering under new Muslim rulers, and that the Byzantine Empire faced pressure from advancing Seljuk Turks. Urban's speech promised salvation for those who took up arms. Full remission of sins for those who fought for Christ's cause. The message spread like wildfire. Knights, nobles, peasants, and even entire families answered the call, sewing red crosses onto their garments as a sign of their vow. The First Crusade, 1096 to 1099. The early waves included both trained knights and vast numbers of ordinary people. The People's Crusade, a poorly armed and undisciplined mass, met disaster before reaching the Holy Land. But the later, organized forces of knights and lords pushed through Anatolia, besieged Antioch, and finally captured Jerusalem in 1099, establishing several Crusader states along the Levantine coast. For medieval Europe, this was seen as a miraculous triumph. For the region's Muslim and Jewish populations, it was a time of great violence and upheaval. The Crusader states. Following the First Crusade's success, new kingdoms were carved out. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa. These territories were defended by small European garrisons, bolstered by military orders like the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers, who blended monastic vows with the duties of professional warriors. Subsequent Crusades. Over the next 2 centuries, more crusades followed, each with different goals and outcomes. Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, sparked by the fall of Edessa, it ended in failure for the Crusaders. Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, led by figures like Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. This campaign sought to reclaim Jerusalem after its capture by the great Muslim leader Saladin. Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204, famously diverted from its original goal. Crusaders instead sacked Constantinople, deepening the divide between Eastern and Western Christendom. Later Crusades included campaigns in North Africa, the Baltic, and even against Christian groups deemed heretical within Europe. Life on Crusade. For knights and soldiers, the Crusades were long, arduous campaigns involving months of travel by land or sea. Supply lines were stretched thin, and disease often claimed more lives than battle. Camps became melting pots of languages, cultures, and faiths. The experience could be transformative. Crusaders returned with new foods, fabrics, spices, and knowledge, but also with stories of hardship, heroism, and loss. The role of religion. The Crusades were fueled by the idea of indulgences, spiritual rewards granted by the Church for participation. The red cross worn by Crusaders symbolized both a pledge and a public declaration of their cause. Church services, blessings, and the presence of clergy were part of the military life. Chaplains marched alongside soldiers, hearing confessions and conducting mass in tents beneath desert skies. Cultural encounters. While the Crusades were often brutal wars, they also brought cultural contact between East and West. European Crusaders encountered advanced Muslim medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. They saw cities with sophisticated water systems, vibrant markets, and libraries rich with ancient knowledge. These encounters, sometimes through trade, sometimes through capture and translation of texts, helped to transmit classical Greek and Arab scholarship back to Europe, feeding the intellectual revival that would later flourish into the Renaissance. Economic and political impact. The Crusades boosted maritime trade, especially for Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa, which ferried Crusaders and profited from Eastern goods. Politically, they strengthened the papacy's influence for a time but also deepened rivalries between Christian kingdoms. They also set precedents for organized, large-scale warfare under religious justification. The view from the other side. For Muslim leaders, the Crusades were invasions by foreign powers into lands long part of the Islamic world. Figures like Saladin became renowned not only for military skill but for chivalry and mercy toward opponents. For Byzantine Christians, the Crusades were a complex and often bitter experience, at times alliances, at times betrayal, culminating in the sack of Constantinople in 1204. The end of the Crusader states. By the late 13th century, the Crusader strongholds were falling one by one. The final outpost, Acre, was captured in 1291, marking the end of European control in the Holy Land. While attempts at later crusades occurred, the era of large-scale expeditions to the Levant had passed. An imagined scene, the road to Jerusalem. It is the dusty summer of 1191. A column of crusaders marches under the blazing Levantine sun. Mail armor glints, banners ripple in the wind, and the rhythmic thud of boots and hoofs fills the air. In the ranks, a young knight from Burgundy exchanges words with an Italian merchant who joined the cause for both faith and fortune. At night, campfires dot the plain, and priests walk among the men, offering blessings before the next day's march. In the distance, the walls of a fortified city rise, both a promise and a challenge. Part 18, Science and Technology. The medieval world is often painted in the popular imagination as an age of darkness and stagnation, a long pause in human innovation between the glories of ancient Rome and the brilliance of the Renaissance. Yet this image is misleading. The Middle Ages were in fact a time of steady, often ingenious development in science, engineering, and technology. While not every leap was dramatic, the cumulative effect was transformative, laying the groundwork for the modern world. The medieval mind approached science differently than we do today. Inquiry was bound up with faith, philosophy, and practical necessity. The word scientist did not yet exist. Instead, there were scholars, natural philosophers, engineers, monks, artisans, and physicians, each contributing to a growing body of knowledge. If you walked through a medieval town, castle, or monastery, you would see technology everywhere. In the grinding of grain by water-powered mills, the stained glass windows of cathedrals, the construction of stone bridges, the illumination of manuscripts, and the armor on a knight's back. This was a world of both preservation and invention. The preservation of knowledge. In the early medieval period, much of Europe's scientific knowledge was preserved by monasteries. Monks painstakingly copied ancient Greek and Roman texts, often in Latin, in scriptoria. They also recorded their own observations about astronomy, agriculture, and medicine. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, scholars in Baghdad, Cordoba, and other centers translated and expanded upon Greek, Persian, and Indian works. This preserved not only Aristotle, Galen, and Euclid but also introduced new ideas in mathematics, chemistry, and navigation. Through trade, conquest, and the Crusades, many of these works eventually reached European scholars. Universities and scholarly exchange. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the rise of universities, in Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and elsewhere, created formal settings for higher learning. Here, natural philosophy encompassed what we might now call science. Students studied logic, geometry, astronomy, and medicine alongside theology. These universities often relied on the works of Aristotle, newly reintroduced through Arabic translations. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas sought to reconcile ancient philosophy with Christian theology, shaping both intellectual and scientific thought. Agricultural innovations. Farming was the backbone of medieval society, and advances in agriculture had profound effects on productivity and population growth. Key developments included the heavy plow, suited for the heavy, clay-rich soils of northern Europe. It could turn deeper furrows. The three-field system, rotating crops over 3 fields instead of 2, increased yields and reduced soil exhaustion. Horse collar, allowed horses to pull plows and carts more efficiently without choking. Improved harnesses and horseshoes, increased animal productivity and transportation capacity. These improvements meant more food, better nutrition, and the ability to support growing towns. Engineering feats. Medieval engineers tackled ambitious projects with creativity. Castles, complex defensive structures with walls, moats, drawbridges, and machicolations for dropping stones or boiling oil. cathedrals, the Gothic style brought soaring ceilings, pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses. These marvels required advanced knowledge of geometry and materials. Bridges and roads, stone bridges replaced wooden ones, improving trade routes. The skills of masons, carpenters, and metalworkers were passed down through guilds, ensuring high standards of craftsmanship. Mechanical power. Water and wind were harnessed for productive work. Watermills, used to grind grain, full cloth, and even power early industrial machines. Windmills appeared in Europe by the 12th century, ideal for flat, windy regions. Clockwork, the first mechanical clocks emerged in the late Middle Ages, regulating time in monasteries and towns. These technologies freed human and animal labor for other tasks, increasing efficiency. Military technology. Warfare spurred its own kind of innovation. Armor evolved from chainmail to full plate by the late medieval period, offering greater protection. Siege engines, trebuchets, mangonels, and battering rams were refined for maximum impact. Longbow and crossbow changed the dynamics of battle, enabling trained archers to pierce armor at range. Gunpowder weapons, introduced to Europe in the 14th century, first in crude cannons, later transforming warfare entirely. Medicine and health. Medical knowledge was a mix of classical texts, folk remedies, and religious belief. Physicians relied on the works of Galen and Hippocrates, often filtered through Arabic translations, and focused on the theory of humors. Hospitals were often run by monastic orders, providing care for the sick, poor, and pilgrims. Surgery existed but was limited in scope, often left to barber surgeons. Herbal medicine was common, with monks cultivating gardens of medicinal plants. Mathematics and astronomy. Medieval scholars advanced European understanding of numbers, algebra, and geometry through contact with the Islamic world. The Hindu-Arabic numeral system, 0 to 9, gradually replaced cumbersome Roman numerals, making calculations faster and more accurate. Astronomy served both religious and practical purposes, determining the date of Easter, guiding navigation, and aiding in agriculture. Observations were recorded in manuscripts, and astrolabes were used to chart the positions of stars and planets. Navigation and exploration. By the late Middle Ages, maritime technology was improving. The magnetic compass, brought from China via the Islamic world, it revolutionized sea travel. Better ship designs, the caravel, with its combination of square and lateen sails, could handle both coastal and oceanic voyages. Portal and charts, detailed coastal maps aided navigation for traders and explorers. These advances would eventually set the stage for the age of exploration. Everyday innovations. Technology also touched the daily lives of ordinary people. Eyeglasses appeared in Italy in the late 13th century, extending the working life of scribes and scholars. Paper, introduced from the Islamic world, cheaper than parchment, it expanded the spread of written material. Printing press, 15th century, though at the very end of the medieval period, Gutenberg's press revolutionized communication. An imagined scene, the monastic workshop. It is a crisp autumn morning in a Benedictine monastery. In the scriptorium, monks in brown robes bend over desks, copying a Latin text of Aristotle's Physics. Outside, the rhythmic thump of a water wheel powers the mill that grinds grain for bread. In the courtyard, a young lay brother adjusts a wooden mechanism designed to lift heavy stones, part of a project to repair the cloister wall. At night, the monks gather in the library, illuminated by oil lamps, to discuss whether the motion of the heavens follows perfect spheres or invisible crystalline shells. Part 19, Late Medieval Changes. The later Middle Ages, roughly the 14th and 15th centuries, were a time of transition. The world of feudal bonds, chivalric ideals, and the medieval mindset was still strong, yet beneath the surface, new economic, cultural, and political forces were beginning to reshape society. This was an era of contrasts, a time of devastating crises, but also one of remarkable recovery and innovation. By the dawn of the 16th century, The medieval order had been transformed, setting the stage for the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the beginnings of the modern age. Population and prosperity then collapse. The High Middle Ages, 11th to 13th centuries, had seen steady population growth, fueled by agricultural expansion, stable trade routes, and relative political order. Villages expanded, towns flourished, and new lands were brought under cultivation. But in the 14th century, Europe faced a series of shocks that would shatter this prosperity. The most dramatic was the Black Death, the bubonic plague pandemic that swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351, killing an estimated one-third to one-half of the population. The loss of so many lives created ripple effects in every sphere. Labor became scarce, giving surviving peasants and workers more bargaining power. Many villages were abandoned entirely. Religious fervor deepened for some, while others questioned the church's ability to protect them. The decline of feudalism. The feudal system had long tied peasants to the land and lords through mutual obligation. But the demographic shifts after the plague weakened these bonds. Lords, desperate for labor, often offered better terms to peasants. Some peasants left their traditional holdings entirely, seeking wages in towns. The rise of tenant farming and paid labor marked a gradual shift toward a money-based economy. By the 15th century, in many regions, serfdom was in retreat. Urban growth and a money economy. Towns and cities, though hit hard by the plague, rebounded over time. They became hubs of craft production, trade, and finance. Merchants grew wealthy, and guilds, associations of craftsmen and tradesmen, maintained quality and training standards. The growing importance of cash transactions over barter led to the rise of banks and credit systems, particularly in Italian city-states like Florence, Venice, and Genoa. This shift eroded the purely land-based power of the nobility and introduced new economic players, wealthy merchants and financiers. Political centralization. Late medieval monarchs sought to consolidate power, moving away from the loose feudal hierarchy toward stronger centralized states. In France, the Capetian and later Valois kings increased royal authority, especially after the 100 Years' War. In England, the crown's authority fluctuated due to civil conflicts like the Wars of the Roses. Spain, through the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, began to unify as a powerful kingdom. This era also saw more sophisticated bureaucracies, tax systems, and standing armies. The 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453. This long conflict between England and France was rooted in dynastic claims to the French throne but expanded into a struggle for national identity. Early battles like Crécy and Agincourt showcased the deadly effectiveness of the English longbow. France's fortunes revived in the later stages, aided by figures like Joan of Arc, whose leadership and visions inspired French forces. The war drained resources but also fostered technological advances in siegecraft and firearms. When it ended, the map of Europe, and the concept of nationhood, was changed. The rise of professional armies. Where medieval warfare had once relied on feudal levies and knightly retinues, late medieval rulers increasingly turned to professional soldiers and mercenaries. This shift was aided by gunpowder weaponry, which made traditional knightly combat less decisive. The expense of maintaining skilled archers, gunners, and pikemen year-round. The image of the armored knight still held cultural power, but the battlefield was changing. Shifts in religion. The late Middle Ages were a challenging time for the Church. The Avignon Papacy, 1309 to 1377, when the popes resided in Avignon instead of Rome, raised questions about papal independence. The Great Schism, 1378 to 1417, with rival popes claiming legitimacy, fractured Christendom's unity. Reformist voices like John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia criticized church corruption and emphasized scripture over clerical authority. While the church remained central to daily life, seeds of the Reformation were being sown. Cultural flourishing. Even amid political and religious turmoil, the arts flourished. Gothic architecture reached its peak, producing masterpieces like the cathedrals of Milan and Seville. Literature reflected new sensibilities. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales offered vivid portraits of medieval society, while Dante's Divine Comedy blended classical learning with Christian theology. Patronage by wealthy merchants and princes supported painters, sculptors, and scholars, particularly in Italy. This patronage culture would soon blossom into the Renaissance. Technology and printing. The late medieval period saw rapid advancements. Gunpowder weapons evolved from crude bombards to more accurate cannons. Ship design improved, with caravels enabling longer voyages. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century, transformed the spread of knowledge. Books became cheaper and more accessible, fueling literacy and intellectual exchange. This technological momentum would carry Europe into a new age. Exploration and expansion. By the late 15th century, Portuguese navigators like Bartolomé Dias and Vasco da Gama were rounding Africa to reach Asia. Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492, funded by Spain, opened the way to the Americas. While these journeys mark the end of the medieval period in many historians' eyes, they were built on the maritime innovations and commercial ambitions that had been developing for centuries. An imagined scene, a city on the brink of change. It is the year 1480 in Florence. The sun sets behind the dome of the cathedral, casting long shadows on the cobblestone streets. Merchants close their stalls, locking away bolts of silk and chests of spices from the Levant. In a nearby workshop, a printer pulls a fresh sheet from the press, a pamphlet of poetry that will soon circulate through the city. Down the street, a young painter mixes pigments for a commission from a wealthy wool merchant. The air is alive with the mingling scents of baking bread, melting wax, and freshly inked paper. This is still a medieval city, but the age to come is already knocking at its gates. Part 20, Legacy of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages have long since passed, but their echoes remain in our buildings, our laws, our languages, our traditions, and even in the way we think about the world. Though centuries separate us from knights, cathedrals, and bustling medieval markets, the influence of this thousand-year span is woven into the very fabric of modern life. To speak of the legacy of the Middle Ages is to trace countless threads, some visible, others subtle, that stretch from the medieval world into our own. It means recognizing that the Middle Ages were not a stagnant pause between Rome and the Renaissance, but a dynamic period whose innovations and ideas shaped the trajectory of history. Political and legal foundations. One of the most enduring legacies is the development of political institutions and legal frameworks that still form the basis of governance today. Parliaments and representative bodies, while the exact forms varied across Europe, assemblies like the English Parliament, the French Estates General, and the Cortes in Spain established the principle that rulers should consult their subjects, or at least their nobles and clergy, on matters like taxation. Common law, in England, the evolution of a unified legal system rooted in precedent, rather than only royal decree, became the foundation for many modern legal systems around the world. Charters of Rights, the Magna Carta of 1215, initially a peace agreement between King John and rebellious barons, evolved into a powerful symbol of limiting arbitrary power and protecting certain rights. Urban life and trade. The revival and growth of towns in the Middle Ages paved the way for modern urban culture. Markets, guilds, and merchant leagues like the Hanseatic League fostered trade across regions. The very concept of a middle class. Citizens who were neither peasants nor nobility but whose wealth and influence came from commerce, has its roots in medieval cities. City walls may have given way to sprawling suburbs, but the idea of civic pride, municipal governance, and organized infrastructure is a medieval inheritance. Education and intellectual traditions. The medieval period saw the birth of the university as a formal institution of higher learning. Places like Bologna, Oxford, and Paris began as communities of scholars and students, eventually developing structures, degrees, faculties, curricula that remain central to higher education today. Scholasticism, the medieval approach to harmonizing faith and reason, encouraged rigorous debate and logical argumentation. While the questions may have changed, the methods of inquiry, citation, and disputation that dominate academia are part of this intellectual lineage. Language and literature. The Middle Ages nurtured the languages we speak today. Vernacular literature, works written in the everyday tongues of the people rather than Latin, helped define and preserve regional languages. Dante's Divine Comedy elevated Italian. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales captured Middle English in its vivid variety. The Song of Roland and other epics celebrated cultural values in French and other vernaculars. Our literary traditions, from epic fantasy to historical fiction, draw heavily on medieval settings, imagery, and archetypes. Art and architecture. Walk through almost any European city today, and you will find the skyline punctuated by spires and towers that date back to the Middle Ages. The Gothic cathedral, with its pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses, remains a marvel of engineering and beauty. Romanesque churches, fortified castles, and medieval bridges continue to inspire architects and artists. Even in modern design, the medieval love of intricate detail, symbolic imagery, and blending of form with function finds echoes. Religious practices and institutions. Christianity in the medieval period shaped the moral and spiritual framework of Europe. The structure of parishes, dioceses, and monastic orders persisted into modern times. Many religious festivals, from Christmas to Easter, retained elements of medieval liturgy and seasonal observance. Even outside of Christianity, medieval patterns of religious organization influenced Islamic, Jewish, and other faith communities in their respective regions. Scientific and technological continuity. The so-called scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries did not emerge in isolation, it built upon medieval foundations. Advances in mechanics, optics, and astronomy by medieval scholars, both in Europe and in the Islamic world, laid essential groundwork. The use of the compass, mechanical clocks, and improved ship designs all stem from medieval ingenuity. The culture of careful observation, record-keeping, and experimentation that defines modern science has its roots in medieval monastic and scholarly traditions. Cultural myths and imagination. Knights, castles, and quests, the symbols of medieval romance, have endured in our collective imagination. From Arthurian legends to modern fantasy epics, medieval ideals of honor, loyalty, and adventure continue to inspire. The fascination with medieval tournaments, heraldry, and courtly love still thrives in reenactments, festivals, and popular media. Agricultural and culinary practices. Many farming techniques refined in the Middle Ages, crop rotation, selective breeding of animals, improved plows, remained in use for centuries and shaped rural economies well into the modern era. Culinary traditions, too, owe much to medieval kitchens. The pairing of spices with meats, the cultivation of certain grains, and the serving of meals and courses all have deep roots in this period. Law, justice, and rights. The medieval system of courts, juries, and codified laws influenced legal norms that extend far beyond Europe. The emphasis on local courts for minor disputes and higher courts for appeals laid out a hierarchy still recognizable in today's judicial systems. The concept that rulers should be subject to the law, though often more ideal than reality in the Middle Ages, is a cornerstone of modern governance. An imagined scene, the modern city with medieval roots. It is a spring morning in a European city, let us say Prague. Tourists gather in the old town square, their cameras pointing toward the astronomical clock, first installed in the early 15th century. The cobblestones underfoot have been worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Nearby, the spire of a Gothic church rises into the blue sky, its bells ringing the hour. Yet just beyond the old quarter, modern trams glide along steel tracks, and glass-fronted buildings house international banks. The city breathes with two rhythms, one medieval, one modern, woven together so seamlessly that most who walk here barely notice the centuries pressing in around them. Why the Middle Ages still matter. To dismiss the Middle Ages as merely dark is to ignore the richness of human creativity, resilience, and adaptation that defined the era. Medieval people faced famine, plague, and war, yet they also built, learned, and dreamed in ways that still shape our world. The medieval legacy is not just in stone walls and ancient manuscripts, it lives on in our institutions, our art, our languages, and our collective imagination. To study the Middle Ages is to understand not only where we came from, but also how much of that past we carry forward. Together, these chapters have journeyed through nearly every facet of medieval life. From the humblest peasant cottage to the soaring vaults of cathedrals, from the clang of the blacksmith's hammer to the quiet turning of pages in a monastic library. The Middle Ages were not a pause between great civilizations, but a civilization in their own right, whose heartbeat still echoes in the world we know today. Thank you once again for tuning into Background Historian, and I hope you have a splendid night. See you tomorrow.